Staring down at my glowing phone screen, I read the text message from my fiancé 24 hours before we were supposed to walk down the aisle. He told me his mother was inviting me to a rehearsal dinner. I naively assumed it would be a standard, joyous pre-wedding celebration. However, by the end of that fateful evening, my future mother-in-law leaned over her half-eaten plate of overpriced lobster, completely ignoring my presence, and whispered something in fluent Italian to the man I was supposed to marry. They both chuckled darkly, looking at me as if I were a clueless sheep being cheerfully guided to the slaughterhouse. Before getting up from that suffocating table, I smiled a sweet, entirely fabricated smile, took my mother-in-law by the hand, and squeezed her fingers so fiercely that her gaudy diamond rings dug painfully into her fragile bones. Looking her dead in the eye, I replied in absolutely flawless, unaccented Italian. My name is Clara, and at 33 years of age, I almost made the catastrophic mistake of marrying into a lineage of absolute, blood-sucking parasites. I happen to be the founder and chief executive officer of a highly lucrative digital forensics and cybersecurity enterprise. This was a massive truth I had deliberately kept hidden, allowing my arrogant fiancé and his terribly snobby family to believe I was merely a mid-level tech support employee who fixed routers for a modest living. Before I dive deeper into this chaotic saga, please let me know where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to this channel if you have ever had the profound displeasure of dealing with a toxic, manipulative family who wrongly thought they could underestimate your intelligence and worth. Trust me entirely. You are going to want to hear exactly how I transformed my lavish wedding day into a spectacular crime scene for their massive egos. The rehearsal dinner was hosted at a ridiculously overpriced, highly pretentious restaurant in the heart of downtown Manhattan. Shimmering crystal chandeliers hung menacingly low over tables draped in exceptionally heavy white linen. Julian, my fiancé, sat beside me, looking undeniably handsome in a bespoke, custom-tailored Italian suit. He claimed to work as an elite investment banker, or at least, that was the grand illusion I had been sold. His entire family paraded around the elegant dining room with their noses held high, acting as though they held the deeds to all of Wall Street. His mother, Victoria, sat directly across from us. She spent the evening aggressively swirling her $200 glass of red wine while eyeing my simple, unbranded silk dress with a look of poorly concealed revulsion. For the past 12 months, she had made it her personal mission to ensure I felt like an uneducated orphan with absolutely no aristocratic pedigree. We had barely finished our expensive appetizers when Victoria commenced her usual theatrical, passive-aggressive performance. Sighing loudly enough to draw attention, she looked around at the other affluent, well-dressed guests seated at our expansive table. "It is just so incredibly noble of our Julian to look right past social class," Victoria announced, ensuring her sharp voice carried easily over the gentle clinking of silver forks against fine china. Most successful men in his elite financial position would strictly require a bride with a proper, established family background. But Julian possesses such a wonderfully charitable heart. He is taking in a girl who grew up with absolutely nothing. Truly, it is almost like a rescue mission for him. I kept my facial expression perfectly blank, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately craved, and took a slow, methodical sip of my sparkling water. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shed a single tear of humiliation. I simply turned my head and watched Julian. Instead of leaping to my defense and protecting his future wife, he chuckled softly and patted the back of my hand with a sickening layer of condescension. "Come on, mother, play nice," Julian said, though his tone was thoroughly amused and entirely lacking in reprimand. He absolutely loved it. He adored playing the role of the wealthy, benevolent savior rescuing my poor, unfortunate, poverty-stricken soul. What these arrogant fools didn't know was that my cybersecurity company had recently been officially valued at $45 million. Furthermore, I had quietly paid the exorbitant bill for this entire rehearsal dinner because Julian had conveniently claimed his massive liquid funds were temporarily tied up in a highly complex offshore portfolio. The dreadful dinner dragged on, morphing into a suffocating, hours-long marathon of veiled insults, backhanded compliments, and arrogant boasting. Victoria bragged endlessly about their massive generational family estate in the Hamptons. She loudly complained about the supposedly crippling high taxes that were burdening T. Heir vast generational wealth. I simply nodded politely, flawlessly playing the assigned role of the quiet, deeply grateful, uneducated bride. I suppose my continued silence gifted them a false, incredibly dangerous sense of security. They truly believed I was completely oblivious. They thought I was profoundly stupid. As the expensive dessert plates were finally being cleared away by the waitstaff, Victoria leaned significantly closer to Julian. She completely ignored my physical presence at the table and abruptly switched her language to Italian, entirely assuming the uneducated orphan girl sitting across from her only comprehended English. Smirking wickedly, she whispered, "She looks so incredibly cheap, Julian, but her signature tomorrow afternoon will permanently save our house in the Hamptons. Are you absolutely certain that your lawyer successfully slipped the cross-ownership equity clause into the final draft of the prenup?" Julian smirked right back at her. Taking a slow, arrogant sip of his dark, bitter espresso, he replied in Italian, "Do not worry for a second, Mother. A full 50% of her little tech company will legally be mine the absolute second we exchange our wedding rings. She is far too uneducated and stupid to have her own attorney read the final printed draft." My blood instantly turned to freezing ice in my veins, but my heart continued to beat with a terrifyingly calm, steady, and calculated rhythm. The man I was supposed to pledge my life to in less than 12 hours had just casually admitted to forging a highly binding legal document in order to steal half of my entire life's work. They desperately needed my hidden, massive wealth to rescue their crumbling, fake aristocratic empire. I carefully placed my heavy linen napkin onto the table and slowly stood up. Without rushing, I walked around the edge of the table until I was standing directly next to Victoria. I smiled warmly at her, reaching out and grabbing her right hand. I squeezed her delicate fingers together with a sudden, crushing, bone-grinding grip. Her smug, superior expression vanished in a millisecond, rapidly replaced by a sharp, highly visible gasp of physical pain. "The pasta served here tonight was truly excellent, Victoria," I whispered down to her in flawless, unaccented, perfect Italian. "Enjoy it thoroughly, because this will undoubtedly be the very last expensive meal you will not be forced to wash dishes in the back room to pay for." I released my crushing grip on her hand. Victoria sat completely paralyzed in her dining chair, the color entirely draining from her heavily powdered face until she looked like a ghost. Julian fumbled and dropped his espresso cup. The dark, scalding liquid spilled everywhere, staining the pristine white tablecloth. His jaw went entirely slack as he stared up at me in absolute, unadulterated horror. They were both completely petrified. I did not utter a single additional word to either of them. I simply turned my back and confidently walked out of the elegant restaurant, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the highly polished marble floor. I stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the New York night and got straight into my waiting black car. I did not shed a single, pathetic tear. As the car smoothly pulled away from the illuminated curb, I reached deep into my leather bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted work laptop. The screen instantly illuminated the dark confines of the back seat. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, effortlessly bypassing standard security firewalls and directly accessing my company's central servers. If Julian truly wanted to initiate a deadly game of corporate espionage and financial ruin, he had just aggressively challenged the exact wrong woman on the planet. The digital cyber hunt had officially commenced, and I was fully prepared to burn his entire fabricated life straight to the ground. My phone began aggressively vibrating the absolute second I stepped into my luxurious hotel suite. The caller ID flashed Julian's name, accompanied by a bright photograph of us smiling warmly on a sunny beach in Malibu. Looking at it now, it was nothing more than an image of pure, meticulously fabricated happiness. I carelessly tossed my room keys onto the glass coffee table, took a slow, incredibly deep breath to completely steady my racing pulse, and answered the incoming call. I made a conscious effort to let my voice tremble just a little bit, perfectly mimicking the pathetic sound of an overwhelmed, insecure, and highly confused bride. "Julian," I answered softly, ensuring my tone remained submissive and fragile. "Babe, what on earth was that back there?" he instantly demanded, his voice thick with entirely fake concern layered over a heavy coating of condescension. He was already launching his ship into full-blown gaslighting mode. "You completely and totally overreacted at the restaurant, Clara. Your Italian eye is seriously rusty and broken. My mother was absolutely not talking about a prenup or stealing your company. She was simply saying you look very pretty in your silk dress and that she sincerely hopes the wedding goes smoothly tomorrow. You really embarrassed her in front of all our affluent friends." I sat down gracefully at the heavy mahogany desk tucked in the corner of the hotel's suite and flipped open the lid of my laptop. The sleek, black machine hummed to life instantly. "I see," I murmured softly into the phone receiver, letting out a perfectly timed, highly believable sigh of manufactured guilt. "I am so incredibly sorry, Julian. The intense stress of the wedding planning has me so overwhelmed. I must have completely misheard the mental translation. My head has been spinning in circles all day long. Please, beg Victoria to accept my apologies for my highly erratic behavior." As I continuously fed his massive, fragile ego with those pathetic, submissive apologies, my fingers were already flying rapidly across my keyboard. Julian had absolutely no idea who he was truly dealing with in the dark. Approximately 6 months ago, he had casually complained that his personal laptop was running entirely too slowly. He asked me to fix it, foolishly assuming my supposed tech support job meant I merely cleared internet browser caches and rebooted hard drives. While I was pretending to clean up his cluttered hard drive, I had quietly and efficiently installed a deep-root, untraceable backdoor into his entire digital ecosystem. "Oh, please do not worry about it, babe," Julian replied smoothly, his voice revealing how clearly relieved he was that I had backed down and submitted so quickly. His tone instantly shifted back to that arrogant, overly confident cadence he loved to employ. "You just focus entirely on getting your beauty sleep tonight. Tomorrow is going to be the absolute best day of our entire lives. We are going to build a massive, incredible future together. Just rest your pretty head. I will handle absolutely everything from here." "You are so wonderfully good to me, Julian," I said sweetly, laying the deception on thick. "I will see you at the altar tomorrow." I immediately ended the call and tossed my vibrating phone onto the massive hotel bed. The helpless, confused bride act was officially and permanently over. On my laptop screen, my company's master administrative dashboard booted up. The glowing, highly complex interface did not display a mid-level, average corporate salary. In stark, crisp, undeniable numbers, the main dashboard proudly displayed the current global market valuation of my sole proprietorship, $45 million. I had painstakingly built a massive data forensics empire from a cramped, unair-conditioned college dorm room, while Julian was busy failing out of a prestigious finance firm. I personally specialized in tracking heavily hidden offshore assets for massive corporate clients, aggressively breaking through military-grade digital firewalls, and exposing complex international financial fraud. Julian attempting to hide basic financial secrets from me was exactly like a toddler's trying to hide a stolen plastic toy from a seasoned, veteran private detective. I swiftly initiated a highly secure proxy chain, bouncing and routing my internet connection through encrypted servers located in Switzerland and Singapore. Within 30 short seconds, I successfully pinged Julian's personal cell phone and his supposedly secure encrypted iCloud account. The fool genuinely thought his basic two-factor authentication would protect his secrets. He was incredibly, catastrophically wrong. Because I possessed backdoor administrative access to his specific telecommunications provider, I seamlessly intercepted the 6-digit security text code before it even had a chance to flash onto his phone screen. Access was instantly granted. The bright screen flooded with the totality of his private digital life. Text messages, private bank statements, supposedly deleted emails, and his entire browsing history were all laid bare before my scanning eyes. I completely bypassed the useless, annoying clutter of his late-night group chats with his arrogant groomsmen, and I fully ignored his pathetic, clumsy attempts at flirting with random women on various social media platforms. I was not looking to bust him for petty infidelity. I was actively hunting for the financial guillotine he and his terrible mother were preparing to drop onto my neck tomorrow. I quickly ran a rapid, highly targeted keyword search across his entire synchronized cloud drive. I typed in specific terms like asterisk equity transfer, cross-ownership asterisk, and Hampton's estate asterisk. The advanced system processed the massive amount of digital data in mere seconds. A series of deeply hidden subfolders instantly materialized on my screen, buried deep within a mundane directory he had deceitfully labeled as *Gym Routines*. My eyes narrowed into dangerous slits as I seeked the computer mouse. The encrypted barrier dissolved instantly, melting under the force of my custom decryption software. Right at the very top of the hidden directory was a highly classified folder that made my blood run absolutely ice cold. It was titled Legal Drafts, and the metadata showed it had been modified just 48 hours ago. I leaned significantly closer to the bright monitor, my heart pounding with a deadly, deeply calculated rhythm. It was finally time to see exactly how Julian meticulously planned to rob me blind. I clicked on the folder, and a long list of document files populated the screen. They were all specifically labeled with my name, followed by various sequential version numbers of our prenuptial agreement. I carefully selected the final document, the exact one timestamped just 2 days ago, and opened it. Then, I split my computer monitor precisely in half. On the left side of the screen, I pulled up the original, fair prenuptial agreement that my own expensive attorney had meticulously drafted. On the right side, I displayed the final, altered version Julian had officially submitted to his legal team for the impending public registry. At first, passing glance, the two lengthy documents looked identical. I ran a highly specialized text comparison algorithm that I had personally coded from scratch, instructing the software to highlight any minor or major discrepancies between the two files in a bright, glaring red hue. Pages 1 through 14 remained stark, innocent white. They contained the standard, mutually discussed legal jargon we had verbally agreed upon months ago. They carefully outlined the total protection of our individual premarital assets, confirmed that our personal banking accounts would remain completely separated, and explicitly waived any future right to spousal support in the highly likely event of a divorce. Everything on those pages appeared perfectly normal, standard, and fair. Then the scanning algorithm reached page 15. The entire right side of my computer screen lit up in a glaring, highly aggressive neon red. I leaned intensely forward, my eyes rapidly scanning the heavily altered text. Page 15 was the critical signature page. On my original approved document, this specific section contained a very simple, legally ironclad clause that successfully solidified my absolute, 100% ownership of my cybersecurity firm, along with all of its valuable intellectual property and future market valuations. On Julian's secretly submitted version, however, that vital protective clause had been completely and maliciously erased. In its place was a dense, highly convoluted paragraph of legal manipulation that made my stomach physically churn with disgust. The newly inserted clause explicitly stated that Julian was legally recognized as a vital, founding partner of my company. It falsely, brazenly claimed that he had provided crucial sweat equity, initial startup seed funding, and strategic corporate consulting during the very inception of the business. Therefore, the forged document legally mandated that upon the official, state-recognized certification of our marriage, Julian would automatically and irrevocably be granted a 50% equity stake in my entire enterprise. I stared blankly at the screen, letting the staggering magnitude of his calculated deception wash over me like a tidal wave. I started this tech company in a cramped, miserable college dorm room. I survived on cheap, terrible noodles and slept an average of 4 hours a night for years. I personally built the firewalls, I wrote the endless lines of code, and I ruthlessly secured the massive corporate contracts. Julian had never written a single line of code in his entire privileged life. The man barely knew how to restart his own home wireless router. Yet here he was, legally declaring himself the master architect of my entire life's work. I zoomed in closely on the electronic signatures at the very bottom of the forged page. There was Julian's signature, written in his usual arrogant, sweeping, messy cursive. And right below it was my signature, except I had absolutely, undeniably never signed this specific version of the contract. My sharp mind flashed back to the chaotic day. We finalized the massive stack of paperwork at his lawyer's upscale, intimidating office in Midtown. I distinctly remembered Julian being overly, uncharacteristically attentive that specific morning. He had firmly insisted on fetching me an expensive, customized latte, heavily distracting me with a long, rambling, highly romantic story about the private, secluded villa he had supposedly booked for our upcoming honeymoon in Greece. While my attention was purposefully divided, he must have smoothly, effortlessly slipped this counterfeit page 15 into the thick stack of legal papers right before I put my ink pen to the paper. He had legally forged a binding corporate contract to steal $22.5 million straight. Tea out of my hands. The profound realization hit me like a heavy physical blow to the chest. This entire relationship, spanning from the very first coffee date, had been a deeply calculated, highly predatory lie. Every expensive, massive bouquet of red roses, every romantic, candle-lit dinner reservation, and every sweet, affectionate text message had merely been viewed as a necessary business expense to him. He did not desire a loving wife to build a family with. He desperately wanted a massive, life-saving financial bailout. He viewed our upcoming, sacred wedding not as a beautiful union of two people in love, but as a hostile, aggressive corporate takeover. Victoria's smug, intensely condescending face at the restaurant suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. She fully knew her golden boy was carefully orchestrating a massive, multi-million-dollar financial heist, and she was greedily waiting in the wings to spend the spoils of my endless hard work. A normal, emotionally fragile bride would have instantly collapsed onto the plush hotel room floor in a massive puddle of devastated tears. A normal woman would have immediately called her best friend, crying hysterically, or perhaps stormed directly over to the groom's hotel suite to aggressively confront him, screaming loudly and throwing heavy objects at his head. I did absolutely none of those things. I leaned back into my ergonomic desk chair, tightly crossed my arms over my chest, and let out a short, incredibly cold laugh that echoed off the walls of the quiet room. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of his plan was almost legally impressive, if it had not been so incredibly, painfully reckless. He actually, genuinely believed his superficial charm, and his expensive custom suits could successfully outsmart a woman who had spent her entire professional, adult career aggressively dismantling complex, international cyber fraud syndicates. But as I stared intensely at his forged signature, a new, far more dangerous, and highly analytical question began to form in my racing mind. Julian was deeply arrogant, yes, but he was also incredibly, chronically lazy. Orchestrating a legal forgery of this massive magnitude required a desperate, frantic, sweating level of motivation that I had never once noticed in him before. Why on earth would a supposedly highly successful, independently wealthy investment banker need to steal 50% of my company so urgently and so illegally? What kind of massive, looming financial disaster was he desperately hiding in the dark, unseen shadows of his own fabricated life? I closed the legal folder with a sharp, decisive click of my computer mouse. I instantly pivoted my digital investigation away from the prenuptial agreement and directly targeted his private personal banking records. If he truly wanted to play a dirty, high-stakes game of financial ruin, I was going to unearth every single rotting skeleton he had ever buried in his metaphorical backyard. I forcefully opened his financial portfolio interface, fully ready to follow the digital money trail. The heavy banking application eventually loaded onto my screen, but it did not display the robust, healthy mutual funds and massive blue-chip stocks Julian constantly and loudly bragged about at elite dinner parties. Instead, I found a desolate digital graveyard. His primary, everyday checking account had an available balance of exactly $3,800. For a man who casually dropped $2,000 on a bespoke Italian suit just last week without blinking, this made absolutely zero logical sense. I quickly bypassed his standard retail banking application and dug much deeper into the highly secure institutional clearinghouse servers, illegally tracing his social security number to a supposedly dormant brokerage account. Security firewalls guarding this area were slightly more sophisticated, requiring me to run a highly specialized decryption script that took an agonizing 2 full minutes to crack. When the screen finally refreshed and the data loaded, the absolute truth slapped me forcefully across the face. Julian had not voluntarily left his highly prestigious position at the elite investment bank to pursue independent venture capital, as he had so proudly and arrogantly announced to my friends and colleagues. I successfully pulled his official corporate termination letter, which had been deeply buried in a highly compressed file on a forgotten backup server. He had been unceremoniously, aggressively fired exactly 6 months ago. The strict corporate compliance department had actively caught him orchestrating an incredibly sloppy, highly illegal insider trading scheme. They had forced his immediate, shameful resignation and explicitly threatened him with federal prosecution if he ever attempted to step foot on their trading floor again. His lucrative career on Wall Street was completely, permanently dead. But the shameful, hidden termination was just the very tip of the massive Ensile iceberg. I navigated to his active trading ledger to see exactly what he had been doing to generate cash since he lost his prominent job. Julian had clearly developed a severe, crippling gambling addiction. Only his casino of choice was the highly volatile, totally unforgiving options market. He had heavily leveraged himself into extreme high-risk, short-term tech derivatives, borrowing massive amounts of capital against physical assets he did not actually own. When the volatile tech market experienced a sudden, unexpected correction last quarter, his entire inflated portfolio had been brutally and unforgivingly liquidated. He was not just simply broke. He was buried alive under a suffocating mountain of high-interest debt. A glaring, pulsating red notification blinked relentlessly at the very top of his financial dashboard. It was an active, highly aggressive margin call from a notoriously ruthless New York hedge fund known as Apex Capital. Julian owed them exactly $3.2 million. The massive debt was currently in severe default. How does a disgraced, completely unemployed former banker manage to keep a $3 million corporate shark off his back for 6 entire months? He desperately offers heavy, valuable collateral. I quickly cross-referenced the hedge fund's active lien records with the New York Public Property Registry. My jaw tightened significantly as the official state documents populated onto my screen. The glorious, sprawling Hamptons estate, the absolute crown jewel of Victoria, and the foundation of her entirely fabricated high society image, the beautiful summer house she never ever stopped bragging about to anyone who would listen, was no longer truly theirs. Julian had secretly, illegally used a forged power of attorney to fully collateralize his mother's beloved family home. The ruthless hedge fund now legally held the primary deed to the massive property, and because Julian had entirely missed his last 3 massive penalty payments, the legal grace period was completely, undeniably over. The sprawling estate was legally scheduled for absolute public foreclosure in exactly 48 hours. By Monday morning, Victoria would be officially, permanently locked out of her own mansion. The realization washed over me, cold, sharp, and entirely illuminating. No wonder Victoria was suddenly so willing to play along with the grand wedding. No wonder she suddenly overlooked my distinct lack of aristocratic pedigree and forced a fake smile during our lavish engagement party. They were entirely, utterly destitute. My $45 million company was their absolute, undeniable only lifeboat. Julian desperately needed my stolen equity to rapidly liquidate enough fast cash to completely pay off the angry hedge fund, save his mother's precious house from the public auction block, and successfully avoid federal prison for the heavily forged collateral documents. I was absolutely nothing but a naive sacrificial lamb, waiting to be slaughtered on the altar of their extreme financial incompetence. I leaned far back in my chair, taking a very slow, measured sip of cold water from the hotel mini-fridge, quietly processing the sheer, staggering magnitude of his pathetic, illegal failure. But one small, nagging detail still severely bothered my highly analytical mind. If Julian had absolutely no steady, verifiable income for the past 6 months, and the massive margin call was actively compounding heavy daily interest, how on earth had he managed to keep the ruthless hedge fund from foreclosing on the house last month? I meticulously scanned the incoming transaction history for his primary checking account over the past 30 days. And there it was, a massive, entirely inexplicable influx of liquid cash. Exactly $500,000 had been swiftly wired into his checking account exactly 2 weeks ago, serving as a desperate, temporary penalty payment to temporarily keep the corporate wolves at bay. I quickly traced the originating bank routing number, fully expecting to see a high-interest, dangerous loan from a desperate friend or a highly shady offshore lender. Instead, the screen clearly displayed a standard domestic joint checking account. The account legally belonged to his sister, Chloe. Chloe, the perpetually unemployed, highly entitled, deeply arrogant sister who spent her endless days complaining about the supposed poor service at luxury boutiques and pretending to be a wealthy lifestyle influencer. She had absolutely zero personal income. So, how on earth did she manage to wire $500,000 of liquid cash into her brother's checking account on a random, quiet Tuesday afternoon? I did not even have to run a highly complex algorithm to figure this specific mystery out. I simply pulled the digital wire authorization records and traced the exact origin of the transferred funds. The money had been drained directly, maliciously, from a high-yield savings account mutually shared by Chloe and her husband, Marcus W. As the exact, polar opposite of the terrible parasites he had unfortunately married into. He was a brilliant, highly dedicated African-American trauma surgeon working at one of the very top medical hospitals in the entire city. While Julian and Victoria spent their hollow days scheming, lying, and pretending to be American royalty, Marcus was working grueling, exhausting 80-hour shifts. He stood on his aching feet in the freezing operating room, literally, physically pulling dying people back from the absolute brink of death. He was warm, incredibly genuine, and he always treated me with profound, undeniable respect. During awful, tense family dinners, while Victoria made endless passive-aggressive jabs at my modest background, Marcus was the only one who actually bothered to ask about my day and listened to my answers with sincere, genuine interest. He was a truly good man, and his terrible wife was currently robbing him entirely blind. I dug deeply into the transaction history of their joint savings account. According to the internal banking memos explicitly attached to the file, this specific, massive fund was solely designated as a down payment for a brand new house. Marcus had been meticulously saving that money for over 5 long years, working endless, exhausting overtime shifts, and heavily sacrificing his own physical and mental health to finally buy a beautiful, quiet home in the suburbs where they could finally start a family. Chloe had wiped it entirely out in a single, devastating keystroke. She had illegally forged Marcus's digital signature to completely bypass the dual authorization security protocol at their banking institution, funneling his hard-earned, blood-stained money straight into Julian's completely failing portfolio, just to temporarily keep the hedge fund from taking Victoria's precious house. I vividly remembered the dark, heavy circles under Marcus's eyes at the rehearsal dinner just a few hours ago. He had arrived quite late, apologizing profusely to everyone because an emergency trauma surgery had run incredibly long. He had looked utterly, bone-deep exhausted, yet he still managed to bring an incredibly expensive bottle of wine as a gift for Julian. Meanwhile, Chloe had spent the entire evening loudly rolling her eyes and continuously complaining that he was not paying enough attention to her new designer outfit. The stark contrast between his exhausted, noble dedication and her shallow, criminal entitlement made me feel physically sick to my stomach. She was actively, maliciously bleeding him dry. Chloe was committing blatant federal wire fraud. If the bank ever randomly audited the massive transaction and flagged the mismatched IP addresses during the security authorization process, she could easily face serious, lengthy prison time. But she clearly did not care at all. The family's entirely fake public image was far more important to her than her husband's trust or her own personal freedom. She probably actively rationalized the massive theft by telling herself that Julian would absolutely pay it all back the very second he got his greedy hands on my $45 million company. They were collectively treating my hard-earned millions like a guaranteed, bottomless family slush fund. The sheer, unmitigated depravity of this family was truly staggering. It was not just Julian acting alone in the dark. It was a highly coordinated, multi-generational criminal enterprise cleverly disguised as a high society family. Victoria loudly demanded the extreme luxury lifestyle. Julian committed massive financial fraud to maintain the required illusion. And when Julian inevitably failed, Chloe swooped in to blatantly steal from her unsuspecting, hard-working husband to cover their tracks. They were all completely in on it. They were a pack of well-dressed, ravenous vultures and Marcus, and I were their specifically chosen prey. They viewed outsiders not as human beings with feelings, but purely as walking bank accounts waiting to be violently drained. I sat back heavily in the dim, blue glow of the computer screen, feeling a cold, utterly righteous fury settling deeply into my bones. Julian thought he could easily trap me with a forged prenuptial agreement. He thought he could secure his unearned 50% equity, completely pay off his $3 million margin debt, refund the stolen $500,000 to Marcus before the poor, exhausted surgeon ever noticed it was missing, and then live happily ever after entirely on my dime. He thought he was the absolute smartest person in the entire room. He was about to learn a catastrophic, life-ruining lesson in modern corporate warfare. I closed the financial ledgers and meticulously wiped my digital footprints from the bank's highly secure servers. I left absolutely zero trace of my electronic intrusion. I deeply wanted Julian to walk into that massive church tomorrow feeling exactly like an invincible king. I wanted him standing proudly at the altar, surrounded by his snobby, arrogant friends and his highly toxic family, completely and utterly certain that he had successfully won the ultimate prize. Because the higher you elevate a raging narcissist, the harder and more violently they shatter when you finally cut the cord. I glanced down at the glowing digital clock on the bottom right corner of my screen. It was exactly 2:00 in the morning. Outside the thick hotel window, the normally bustling streets of Manhattan were quiet, tightly wrapped in the deep stillness of the early morning hours. I had exactly 12 hours until the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. 12 hours to completely dismantle a massive fraud, entirely protect my empire, and carefully prepare a spectacular, highly public execution for the parasite who mistakenly thought he could steal my life. I reached for my cell phone, entirely bypassing Julian's endless missed calls and frantic, gaslighting text messages. I scrolled rapidly through my heavily encrypted contact list and pressed the call button for my lead corporate attorney. It was officially time to initiate the poison pill. The phone rang only twice before a groggy, deep voice answered on the other end. Arthur was the absolute most ruthless corporate attorney in all of Manhattan, and he billed an astronomical $1,000 an hour precisely because he answered my phone calls at 2:00 in the morning without complaining. I did not bother with any pleasantries. I explicitly told him to wake up his entire legal team, get out his highly secure laptop, and actively prepare for an emergency hostile asset restructuring. I explained exactly, in great detail, what Julian had done. I told him about the blatantly forged signature on the 15th page of the prenuptial agreement, the deeply hidden margin call, and the rapidly incoming foreclosure on the Hamptons estate. Arthur was wide awake and hyper-focused by the time I finished my second sentence. "A forged prenuptial agreement is a very severe federal offense," Arthur stated, his voice now incredibly sharp and completely alert over the encrypted phone line. "We can easily have him arrested by the FBI before the sun even comes up. We can completely cancel the wedding right now and instantly file for a massive, permanent restraining order to protect your physical and financial safety." I paced slowly across the thick, plush carpet of the hotel suite, looking out at the glittering, endless city lights. "No," I replied evenly, my tone devoid of panic. "Canceling the wedding simply gives him a chance to run away and hide. It gives Victoria a chance to actively spin the false narrative, to cry to her high society friends, and play the ultimate victim. They view my tech company as a giant, unbreakable piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. I want to leave them with a completely, totally empty vault. We are initiating the midnight poison pill protocol right now." Arthur went completely silent for a long moment, deeply processing the absolute magnitude of my extreme demand. The poison pill was an extreme, highly complex corporate defense strategy we had theoretically mapped out when I first founded the company. It was originally designed to prevent aggressive, hostile takeovers from massive tech giants. It involved instantly and permanently liquidating all of my vulnerable personal assets and officially transferring my entire 100% equity stake into an impenetrable, irrevocable offshore blind trust. Once the complex transfer was legally complete, I would personally own absolutely nothing on paper. I would not have direct, immediate access to the capital. I could not independently sell the corporate shares, and absolutely no one could sue me for them or claim them in a fraudulent, deceptive marriage. Clara, if we execute this extreme protocol tonight, there is absolutely zero going back, Arthur warned gravely. You are permanently locking away $45 million in a matter of hours. The legal unspooling alone will take several years if you ever want direct, personal ownership again. By 8:00 this morning, your actual net worth on paper will literally be zero. You will be entirely, legally dependent on the offshore trust administrators. That is exactly the entire point, I said, staring deeply at my own reflection in the dark, cold glass of the hotel window. Julian forged a highly illegal contract to steal exactly half of my net worth. He is banking his entire life and freedom on that specific number. I want his ultimate prize to be exactly half of nothing. Protect the company. I heard the rapid, aggressive clicking of a keyboard over the speakerphone as Arthur immediately began drafting the highly complex emergency transfer documents. He ruthlessly woke up his junior legal partners and his vast network of offshore financial contacts. Within one intense hour, they had successfully established the concrete framework for a high-security blind trust in a strict jurisdiction that absolutely did not recognize domestic civil claims or messy marital property disputes. I digitally signed the massive stack of electronic authorizations, calmly watching my massive, hard-earned personal wealth entirely evaporate from my domestic accounts and funnel directly into the impenetrable, heavily guarded fortress of the blind trust. By 8:00 in the morning, right as the cheerful hotel staff began setting up the beautiful, expensive floral arrangements for the ceremony downstairs, my entire financial footprint would completely and utterly vanish. I was legally broke. If Julian aggressively tried to enforce his fraudulent, forged contract, he would be legally claiming 50% of an entity that no longer existed under my name. His grand plan was completely dead in the water. But simply protecting my assets was not nearly enough for me. Defense is only for people who just want to survive a battle. I wanted absolute, undeniable annihilation. I poured myself another fresh glass of cold water and sat back down at my desk, forcefully pulling up the hedge fund information I had scraped from Julian's compromised computer just an hour ago. Arthur, there is one more vital thing before you log off and get dressed for the day, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Julian actively owes exactly $3.2 million to a ruthless corporate hedge fund called Apex Capital. They hold the primary, legal lien on his mother's massive estate in the Hamptons, and they are actively preparing to foreclose in less than 48 hours. I want you to immediately contact the senior partners at Apex Capital the absolute second the financial market opens this morning. I heard Arthur take a slow, cautious breath. What exactly do you want me to tell them when I call? I smiled wickedly in the completely empty hotel room. They are currently holding highly toxic, entirely useless debt from a disgraced, unemployed banker who absolutely cannot pay them back. Offer to buy Julian's entire debt portfolio for straight cash right now. Offer them a slight premium if you have to, using the emergency corporate slush fund we keep entirely outside the new trust. I do not just want to block his pathetic attempt to steal my money. I want to actively buy his debt. I want to personally own the lien on his mother's house. I want to be his sole, legally binding creditor by the time I walk down that aisle. Arthur let out a low, highly impressed whistle of pure professional admiration. Consider it entirely done, Clara. Happy wedding day. Arthur spoke those highly satisfying final words before ending the secure call, and the line went entirely silent just as the very first bright rays of morning sunlight broke beautifully over the Manhattan skyline. By 9:00 that morning, I was sitting peacefully in the center of the sprawling, luxurious bridal suite at the venue, a cold glass of sparkling water resting easily in my hand. My professional makeup artist was carefully applying the delicate finishing touches to my perfect eyeliner. I looked incredibly serene. Nobody in the world could tell that I had spent the entire night aggressively dismantling a massive corporate fraud scheme and independently securing a $3 million hedge fund debt. My phone pinged softly once with a highly secure message from Arthur. The trust transfer was completely, legally finalized, and the massive debt acquisition paperwork was officially registered in my name. The deadly trap was perfectly set. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the bridal suite swung open aggressively, without a single polite knock. Victoria and Chloe marched right into the room, bringing a highly suffocating, overwhelming cloud of heavy designer perfume with them. They carried themselves exactly like royalty, gracefully gracing a lowly peasant with their presence. Victoria wore an overly elaborate, heavily beaded silver gown that looked far more appropriate for a nighttime red carpet gala than a morning wedding, while Chloe paraded around in a tight, revealing silk dress that clearly cost more than her stolen savings account. Victoria did not offer a polite, standard greeting. She immediately walked right over to where my beautiful, custom Vera Wang wedding dress was hanging gently by the grand window. She reached out and aggressively rubbed the delicate silk fabric between her fingers, her face instantly twisting into a highly practiced mask of polite disappointment. "It is very, very simple, Clara," Victoria said, her voice heavily dripping with entirely fake sympathy. "I suppose it reflects your very modest upbringing perfectly. We are simply just used to things with a bit more grandeur and elegance for our strict family standards, but I'm quite sure Julian will pretend to love it." Chloe snickered loudly from the velvet couch, crossing her long legs and closely inspecting her fresh, expensive manicure. "You really should have let us pick out the dress, Clara," Chloe chimed in lazily. "We have a highly important image to maintain today. Half the city's wealthy elite will be sitting in those pews. We simply cannot have you looking like you bought your gown off a cheap discount rack." I kept my facial expression entirely placid and unbothered, simply letting the makeup artist continue her diligent work. I did not take their pathetic bait. I knew exactly why they were suddenly so highly aggressive and tense this morning. The clock was rapidly ticking down on their impending foreclosure, and the sheer, unspoken panic of their impending financial doom was leaking terribly through their arrogant facades. They desperately needed to assert social dominance over the woman they were actively planning to rob. Victoria walked directly over to my vanity table and aggressively dropped a thick, heavy manila envelope right next to my cosmetics. She impatiently tapped her manicured fingernails against the paper, giving me a tight, highly demanding smile. "Since you are just sitting here doing absolutely nothing, we have one final piece of minor housekeeping to take care of," Victoria announced smoothly, trying to mask her urgency. "Julian's financial advisors sent over a very standard banking proxy. It is just a routine, minor procedural document to streamline the rapid consolidation of your bank accounts with his immediately after the ceremony. It will save you both an annoying trip to the bank on Monday. I brought a pen so you can sign it right now, and we can get it completely out of the way." She pulled an incredibly expensive fountain pen from her designer clutch and held it out to me aggressively. Her eyes were wide and intensely focused, completely betraying the desperate, clawing greed hiding just beneath her expensive makeup. She was lying right to my face. I knew exactly what was hidden inside that envelope. It was an emergency power of attorney document specifically designed to give Julian immediate, totally unrestricted access to my liquid cash the absolute second the wedding concluded, completely bypassing any standard banking delays. They desperately needed my money today before the ruthless hedge fund permanently seized their precious house. I looked calmly at the envelope, then slowly looked up at Victoria's expectant, highly demanding face. I did not reach out for the pen. Instead, I gracefully raised my hand and elegantly pushed her wrist away. "I would absolutely love to sign it, Victoria," I said, ensuring my voice was bright and enthusiastically naive. "But my makeup is almost completely done, and my hands are slightly shaking from all these massive wedding nerves. Plus, my brilliant photographer told me he desperately wants to capture a beautiful, highly candid moment of Julian and me signing our official legal documents right at the altar. It will make such a wonderful, romantic memory for the wedding album. I will happily sign your banking proxy right there at the altar, along with the official marriage license for the photographer." Victoria instantly froze, her hand still hovering awkwardly in the air. A rapid flash of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed her eyes. She looked frantically back at Chloe, who suddenly stopped admiring her nails and sat up completely straight in alarm. "Well," Victoria stammered loudly, desperately trying to regain her slipping composure. That is highly irregular, Clara. Julian explicitly needs this paperwork filed with the attorneys immediately after the ceremony ends. And he will absolutely have it, I replied incredibly sweetly, flashing her a perfect, camera-ready smile. Right at the altar. What could possibly be more romantic than blending our lives together in front of all your esteemed high society friends? Victoria stared at me, her jaw so tightly clenched it looked painful. She desperately wanted to force the pen directly into my hand, but she simply could not risk causing a massive, screaming scene and blowing the entire covert operation just hours before the massive payout. She swallowed her intense frustration and forced a highly stiff, terribly unnatural smile. Fine, Victoria agreed uneasily, angrily snatching the pen back. At the altar. Then do not forget, Clara. Julian is heavily counting on you. She turned rapidly on her heel and marched angrily out of the suite, Chloe trailing very closely behind her like a highly loyal henchman. The heavy door clicked shut loudly. I looked back at my own reflection in the clear mirror. Julian was definitely counting on me, and I was going to deliver a devastating performance they would absolutely never forget. Just as I settled comfortably back into my chair to let the makeup artist finally finish her work, a gentle, highly polite knock sounded at the heavy oak door. It was a stark, welcome contrast to the aggressive entrance Victoria had made just moments prior. The door opened very slowly, and Marcus stepped hesitantly into the suite. He was wearing a sharply tailored, excellent charcoal suit, but the bone-deep exhaustion heavily etched into his face was absolutely impossible to hide. Deep, dark purple circles shadowed his exceptionally kind brown eyes, a very clear sign of the grueling 80-hour hospital shifts he had been pulling all week to save lives. Despite his severe fatigue, he offered me a highly warm, incredibly genuine smile and held out a stunning, custom bouquet of pristine white orchids and vibrant blue hydrangeas. I wanted to come give you these before the sheer madness of the ceremony actually begins, Marcus said, his voice a highly comforting rumble in the quiet room. You look absolutely beautiful, Clara. Julian is an incredibly lucky man. I just wanted to welcome you to the family properly. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of genuine, terrible guilt looking at him. Marcus was the absolute only innocent casualty in the massive war I was about to wage. He had spent years actively working himself to the literal bone to provide for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an endless, easily exploitable ATM. I took the beautiful flowers from his strong hands, genuinely touched by the kind gesture. Thank you, Marcus, I replied softly. That really means the absolute world to me. Before Marcus could say another single word, the suite door swung open violently. Chloe marched back into the room, her eyes instantly locking onto her husband like a heat-seeking missile. The fake, aristocratic smile she had worn earlier was completely, entirely gone, replaced by a highly vicious, ugly scowl. What on earth are you doing in here, bothering the bride? Chloe snapped loudly, aggressively crossing her arms over her expensive silk dress. And far more importantly, where is the velvet box from the jeweler? Please do not tell me you actually showed up empty-handed. Marcus immediately stiffened, his broad shoulders dropping slightly. He glanced highly apologetically at me and my makeup artist before turning slowly to face his angry wife, actively lowering his voice to try and keep the argument private. Chloe, we talked extensively about this last night, he said very calmly, though the intense strain in his voice was glaringly obvious. I am absolutely not buying Julian a $10,000 Rolex for a wedding gift. It is completely, utterly absurd. We simply cannot afford a luxury watch right now, especially when we are supposed to be finalizing the massive down payment for our new house next month. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her loudly demanding a $10,000 watch while she was actively, secretly draining $500,000 from his savings account made my blood absolutely boil. Chloe scoffed extremely loudly, clearly not caring at all that she was making a highly embarrassing scene. Cannot afford it, she mocked cruelly, rolling her eyes highly dramatically. You are a highly respected trauma surgeon, Marcus. Stop acting like we are living in utter poverty. My brother deserves the absolute best on his highly important wedding day. It is a vital matter of respect and family image. All of his groomsmen are gifting him luxury items, and my husband is going to be the absolute only one handing over a cheap paper check. It is completely humiliating for me. Marcus rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking utterly, thoroughly defeated by a conversation he had clearly endured 100 times before. "Chloe, my paycheck does not stretch to infinity," he reasoned gently. "I am actively working as many extra shifts as the hospital will legally allow me to. We firmly agreed the house was our top priority. I wrote Julian a very generous check for $2,000. That is more than enough." $2,000 is an absolute joke, Chloe hissed, stepping aggressively closer to him, her voice heavily dripping with toxic entitlement. "You know exactly how much my family highly values appearances. I gave up a lot of my own incredible potential to support your medical career, Marcus. The very least you could do is make sure my brother is properly honored." I swear, sometimes I heavily wonder why I married a man who absolutely refuses to understand the basic, required standards of my elite lifestyle. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy and extremely uncomfortable. The makeup artist falsely pretended to be intensely focused on her eyeshadow palette, desperately trying to become invisible. Marcus looked down sadly at the floor, swallowing incredibly hard. The vibrant, highly warm man who had walked into the room just moments ago was completely gone, utterly crushed under the immense weight of his wife's relentless, gold-digger mentality. He was a brilliant doctor who saved actual lives daily, yet she made him feel like an absolute failure simply because he would not blindly fund her family's superficial vanity. "I am so sorry, Clara," Marcus said very quietly, not looking up. "I absolutely did not mean to bring this drama into your beautiful bridal suite. I will see you at the ceremony." He slowly turned around, his posture completely sagging, and began to walk heavily toward the door. I could not let him walk away feeling completely, utterly worthless. I knew exactly what was rapidly coming for him in a few short hours, and I desperately needed him to be ready. I stood up incredibly quickly, ignoring the makeup artist's mild protest, and walked swiftly over to him. "Wait, Marcus," I called out, reaching deeply into the small pocket of my silk bridal robe. I pulled out a small piece of hotel stationery that I had intricately folded tightly into a square. Chloe watched me with highly narrowed, incredibly suspicious eyes. I completely ignored her. I grabbed Marcus's right hand and very firmly pressed the folded piece of paper directly into his palm, securely closing his fingers around it. "Thank you again for the incredibly beautiful flowers," I said, looking directly, intently into his tired eyes. "And Marcus, please, ensure you read this when you get to your seat. Keep your phone unmuted during the vows. Trust me entirely." Marcus looked highly confused, but he nodded slowly, smoothly slipping the note into his suit pocket. He walked completely out of the room, leaving Chloe standing there glaring at me with totally open, unchecked hostility. I simply smiled pleasantly, walked right back to my chair, and told the makeup artist I was completely ready for my lipstick. The absolute final piece of the complex puzzle was perfectly in place. While I sat perfectly still, letting the makeup artist expertly apply a bold, vibrant crimson lipstick across the highly manicured courtyard of the luxury estate, Julian was living in an entirely different reality. In the sprawling, massive groom's suite, the air was incredibly thick with the heavy aroma of expensive cigars and the sharp, burning scent of 20-year-old single malt scotch. Julian stood proudly by a massive marble fireplace, a crystal tumbler held securely in his hand, holding arrogant court among his 4 groomsmen. They were all former colleagues from the elite investment bank, men who still proudly wore custom-tailored suits and acted exactly like they owned the entire financial world, even though most of them were heavily drowning in hidden, massive debt just like he was. "To the absolute greatest acquisition of my entire career," Julian announced very loudly, raising his glass of scotch high into the air. The groomsmen cheered aggressively, clinking their heavy glasses together in a chorus of highly arrogant laughter. They did not know the full, illegal extent of his legal forgery, but they knew exactly why he was marrying me. He had spent the last 6 months loudly bragging to them about how he was reeling in a naive, uneducated tech nerd who had stumbled blindly into a $45 million gold mine. To Julian, I was not a human being. I was an uneducated, incredibly lucky orphan who desperately needed a sophisticated banker to manage her sudden, unearned wealth. He truly believed he was doing me a massive favor by illegally taking 50% of my company. "You really, truly pulled it off, man," One of the groomsmen chuckled loudly, slapping Julian highly aggressively on the back. I honestly thought you were going to completely lose the Hamptons house when you got let go from the firm. But here you are, actively marrying a walking ATM machine. Just make absolutely sure you keep her on a very tight leash once the accounts are officially merged. Oh, she will absolutely not be a problem, Julian smirked confidently, taking a very long sip of his strong drink. She is completely, utterly obsessed with me. She barely even looked at the prenup before she happily signed it. By tomorrow morning, my financial portfolio will be completely bulletproof, and I will be sitting proudly on the board of directors of her little computer company. Despite his confident, boasting words and the highly arrogant smirk plastered firmly across his face, a cold, terrible knot of severe anxiety was twisting incredibly tight in his stomach. The massive margin call from the Apex Capital hedge fund was a rapidly ticking time bomb, and the absolute final deadline for foreclosure was tomorrow. He desperately needed the liquid cash from my accounts the very second the priest officially pronounced us husband and wife. Julian quickly excused himself from the loud, obnoxious group and walked right over to the private balcony, overlooking the pristine, green golf course. He nervously pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands slightly trembling from the adrenaline and the lingering, terrible fear of federal prison. He opened his secure messaging app and quickly typed an urgent message to his mother. Is the proxy officially signed? I absolutely need to know the bank transfer is ready to initiate immediately after the reception. He stared intensely at the screen, actively watching the typing indicator bubble pop up, suddenly disappear, and pop up again. Every single passing second felt like a terrible eternity. If I had completely refused to sign the banking proxy, his entire timeline would be entirely destroyed. The ruthless hedge fund would permanently seize the Hamptons estate before Monday morning, and his massive financial fraud would be totally exposed to his entire high society social circle. Finally, Victoria's frantic reply appeared on the screen. She completely refused to sign it in the room, said her hands were shaking terribly from wedding nerves. Julian's heart skipped a massive beat. Pure panic flared in his chest, incredibly hot and sharp. He immediately started typing a frantic, aggressive reply, fully ready to storm violently across the courtyard and absolutely demand that I sign the document right that second. But before his thumb could even hit the send button, a second message from Victoria flashed rapidly onto the screen. She said she will happily do it at the altar instead. She really wants the wedding photographer to capture the exact moment we sign the marriage license and the proxy together. Do not worry for a second. The idiot suspects absolutely nothing. She's just being a highly typical emotional bride, totally obsessed with pictures. Julian let out a massive, shuddering breath of utter relief. He closed his eyes tightly and leaned his head firmly back against the cool glass of the balcony door. At the altar. Of course, she desperately wanted to do it at the altar. It was so perfectly pathetic and entirely in character for the weak, highly romantic woman he thought I was. Signing the banking proxy in front of 300 elite guests would actually work heavily in his favor. It would effortlessly make the financial transfer look like a beautiful, highly public display of total marital trust. It was the absolute perfect cover for his massive crime. He confidently locked his phone and smoothly slipped it back into his pocket, his arrogant confidence fully, entirely restored. He walked right back into the suite and walked straight over to the full-length mirror. He carefully slipped his arms into his custom tuxedo jacket, smoothly adjusting the lapels with absolute, perfect precision. He straightened his black bow tie and shot himself a highly winning, deeply predatory smile in the mirror. He fully, genuinely believed he had just pulled off the greatest financial heist of his entire life. He was fully ready to claim his massive prize. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, the heavy, ornate wooden doors of the historic cathedral swung wide open. A highly hushed silence rapidly fell over the 300 elite guests seated in the highly polished mahogany pews. The golden, warm afternoon light filtered beautifully through the massive stained glass windows, casting vibrant, beautiful colors across the cold marble floor. A highly expensive string quartet positioned near the very front of the church began to play a slow, incredibly elegant classical piece. It was the absolute perfect picturesque setting for a high society wedding. It was exactly the highly expensive illusion Victoria had viciously demanded to definitively prove her family's superiority. I stepped smoothly into the grand entryway entirely, completely alone. I had absolutely no father to walk me down the long aisle, a fact Victoria had loudly and constantly lamented for months. She claimed it was deeply embarrassing for the family image to have a bride walk completely unaccompanied. But as I stood right there in my simple, elegant silk gown, I felt a surge of absolute, undeniable power. I did not need a single person to give me away. I was the absolute sole owner of my own destiny. I had painstakingly built a massive technology empire from nothing with my own 2 hands, and I was about to completely dismantle their generational wealth with a single, highly devastating blow. I took my very first step forward, my heavy dress brushing softly against the cold marble. As I slowly began my long procession, the quiet, cruel whispers of the high society guests rippled rapidly through the cavernous room. They did not even try to politely hide their condescending tones. To these wealthy, arrogant elites, I was just a sad charity case who had somehow managed to trick a brilliant investment banker into an uneven marriage. I kept my chin held highly, confidently hearing every single word they muttered. "Just look at her cheap dress," one older woman aggressively whispered to her husband with incredibly arrogant pity. "It is so terribly plain." Victoria must be absolutely mortified to actively present her to their friends today. From the exact opposite side of the wide aisle, a man who sounded exactly like one of Julian's arrogant banking friends chimed in loudly. "He really is totally throwing his life away on an absolute nobody." The man chuckled softly. "She is just an incredibly lucky orphan girl. Julian is practically actively rescuing her from a life of total mediocrity." I simply smiled softly to myself. Let them whisper. Let them pity the poor orphan girl. They were all sitting in an incredibly expensive church, completely unaware that the groom they so highly praised was a heavily disgraced, unemployed fraud, deeply drowning in $3 million of extreme margin debt. They thought Julian was a highly wealthy savior descending gracefully from his pedestal. In stark reality, he was a desperate, sweating criminal trying to actively steal my hard-earned money, just to heavily keep himself out of a terrible federal penitentiary. Halfway down the incredibly long aisle, I easily spotted Victoria sitting prominently in the front row. She was wearing her ridiculous, highly inappropriate silver gown, sitting totally upright with a smug, incredibly victorious smile. Beside her sat Chloe, looking incredibly, deeply bored as she repeatedly checked her fresh manicure, probably already planning her next massive shopping spree with the stolen $500,000. Right next to Chloe was Marcus. His posture was incredibly rigid. He caught my eye for a very brief second and gave a barely noticeable, highly tense nod. He had thoroughly read my secret note. His phone was sitting face up on his leg, entirely unmuted and fully ready. The absolute first pillar of their entirely fake empire was primed to violently fall. I purposefully turned my attention back to the massive altar. Julian was standing confidently next to the priest, looking exactly like the picture-perfect groom. His expensive custom tuxedo fit entirely flawlessly. His hair was perfectly, heavily styled. As I drew closer, he gave me a highly warm, incredibly loving smile. It was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. His eyes softened convincingly into an expression of pure, undeniable adoration. Anyone looking at him would deeply believe he was staring at the absolute love of his entire life. But I heavily knew the terrifying truth. Behind those charming, fake eyes was a highly calculating predator desperately waiting to cash a forged check. He was absolutely not looking at his future wife. He was looking at a massive $45 million bailout. He was eagerly looking at the woman he thought he had highly successfully tricked into signing away absolutely everything she had ever worked for. My heart absolutely did not flutter. I felt an entirely overwhelming sense of calm clarity powerfully wash over me. The string quartet flawlessly played the final, sweeping notes as I finally, confidently reached the end of the long marble aisle. I stepped firmly up to the front of the altar. The entire cathedral went completely, totally silent, filled heavily with breathless anticipation. Julian took a very small, confident step forward. His loving smile noticeably widened as he highly confidently reached out his hand to lovingly take mine, ready to commence the ceremony that would permanently secure his financial salvation forever. I completely stopped moving entirely. I looked slowly down at his outstretched hand, then very slowly looked right back up deeply into his eyes, and I absolutely did not take his hand. Julian stared in confusion at my hands, which were resting firmly and securely at my sides. A highly rapid flicker of genuine, unadulterated confusion crossed his perfectly sculpted features. He let out a soft, highly nervous chuckle, leaning in slightly. "Come on, babe," he urgently whispered, his voice barely audible over the slowly fading music of the string quartet. "Everyone is looking at us. Give me your hand." I kept my unwavering gaze fixed on his face, my expression entirely, completely unreadable. "I am perfectly fine right here," I replied very quietly. Fully thinking I was merely suffering from a severe, sudden case of stage fright, Julian masked his intense irritation with another highly forced, highly benevolent smile. He smoothly turned his attention to the priest, giving him a slight, highly confident nod to proceed. The elderly priest cleared his throat loudly, properly adjusting his reading glasses, and stepped up to the massive, ornate wooden pulpit. He spread his arms incredibly wide, warmly welcoming the hundreds of wealthy guests who had heavily packed the cathedral. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his deep voice heavily echoing beautifully off the high, vaulted ceilings. "We are gathered here beautifully today in the sight of God, and the active presence of these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The highly traditional words flowed over me exactly like water. I entirely tuned out the standard religious platitudes, completely focusing instead on the heavy energy in the massive room. I could actively feel the highly intense stares of Victoria and Chloe drilling aggressively into my back from the front row. They were sitting anxiously on the edge of their expensive seats, practically actively vibrating with extreme greedy anticipation. They were just minutes away from permanently securing their $3 million bailout. Julian stood proudly beside me, his chest heavy, puffed out with incredibly arrogant pride. He looked exactly like a conqueror actively claiming his hard-won territory. He had completely, totally let his guard down. The priest seamlessly continued through the lengthy opening liturgy, his voice incredibly steady and rhythmic. The cathedral was completely, totally silent, save for the occasional, soft rustle of expensive silk and the highly polite, soft coughs of the elite guests. Every single person sitting in that room deeply believed they were actively witnessing the pathetic, highly embarrassing climax of a gold digger, successfully merging his life with an incredibly naive, highly wealthy victim. Then the priest confidently reached the most highly critical juncture of the entire ceremony. He looked out seriously over the massive congregation, his expression turning incredibly solemn and serious. "If anyone can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." A heavily pregnant, incredibly dense silence blanketed the church. It was the highly traditional pause, a mere expected formality that absolutely no one ever actually expected to be dramatically interrupted. I closely watched from the corner of my eye as Julian let out a very slow, highly deeply satisfied breath. He visibly relaxed his tense shoulders. He truly thought he had crossed the final finish line. He believed his forged contract was permanently secured, and his mother's massive estate was officially saved. I let the heavy silence purposefully stretch for exactly 3 more agonizing seconds. I wanted him to fully taste the absolute certainty of his fake victory. I wanted him to feel completely, incredibly invincible. And then I slowly opened my hands. I let my incredibly beautiful, highly expensive bouquet of white orchids and blue hydrangeas totally slip from my grasp. The massive flowers hit the solid marble floor with a sharp, heavily echoing thud that sounded exactly like a highly explosive gunshot in the totally silent cathedral. The priest blinked rapidly in intense surprise, looking down at the violently scattered petals. Julian turned his head incredibly sharply toward me, his highly arrogant smile instantly, completely vanishing, replaced rapidly by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Before anyone in the massive room could adequately process what was happening, I confidently stepped forward. I moved rapidly past Julian, reached out powerfully, and firmly took the microphone straight out of the hands of the highly startled priest. I turned forcefully to face the hundreds of wide-eyed, highly shocked guests. My posture was perfectly, rigidly straight, my voice completely, entirely devoid of any emotion. I object, I announced incredibly clearly, my voice heavily booming through the massive speakers and aggressively bouncing off the ancient stone walls. Total, entirely paralyzed shock completely gripped the room. Nobody moved an inch. Nobody dared breathe. I object, I completely repeated smoothly, looking directly, fiercely at Julian's horrified, paling face. Mostly because my groom currently has a highly scheduled appointment with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation this exact afternoon, and I simply totally refuse to spend my honeymoon visiting a highly secure federal penitentiary. The cathedral absolutely, violently erupted. It was not just a low murmur. It was an incredibly explosive wave of highly loud gasps, highly shocked screams, and intensely furious whispering. 300 high society guests completely lost their composure simultaneously. In the front row, Victoria leaped aggressively to her feet, her face rapidly turning a violently pale shade of gray. She opened her mouth to scream loudly, but absolutely no sound came out. Chloe immediately dropped her incredibly expensive designer clutch, her hands flying highly rapidly to her mouth in absolute terror. Only Marcus remained perfectly, incredibly still, his eyes entirely locked onto the heavily unfolding destruction, exactly as I had carefully instructed. Julian completely, utterly lost his carefully crafted aristocratic facade. The incredibly charming, wealthy investment banker completely vanished, leaving heavily behind a desperate, sweating, deeply cornered criminal. His face flushed a dark, highly violent red with absolute, unhinged rage. "What the hell are you actively doing?" He hissed violently, lunging aggressively forward to heavily grab my arm and rip the microphone violently away from my hands. "Are you absolutely crazy? Shut up." But I was far faster. I took a highly swift, incredibly calculated step backward, smoothly, totally evading his aggressive, violent grasp. With my completely free hand, I quickly reached into the deeply hidden seam pocket of my custom Vera Wang gown. My fingers rapidly closed around a small, heavy black remote control. I held it up incredibly high for him to clearly see, a deeply cold, highly triumphant smile finally breaking entirely across my face. The digital hunt was over. It was officially time for the execution. I firmly pressed the single, highly visible red button on the remote control. Directly behind the altar, the incredibly massive digital screen that Julian had expensively rented to supposedly display our childhood photos suddenly hummed loudly to life. Instead of a highly romantic fake montage of our beach vacations, the massive screen instantly illuminated the entire cathedral with a stark, highly glaring white light. The heavy shadows in the church completely vanished instantly, heavily exposing Julian perfectly under the incredibly bright glow of his own deception. On the left side of the towering, highly visible display, the entirely original prenuptial agreement meticulously drafted by my highly expensive attorneys appeared. On the exact right side, the heavily altered version Julian had secretly submitted was highly projected in massive, incredibly undeniable high definition. I had highly specifically programmed the advanced presentation software to aggressively highlight the discrepancies. An incredibly bright red box rapidly materialized around page 15 of both legal documents. "Please carefully direct your attention to the large screen behind me," I smoothly instructed the crowd, my voice echoing heavily with absolute, undeniable authority through the microphone. "You are all looking at two highly, entirely different legal documents. The document on the left is the fair contract I actually, legally signed, which fully protected the $45 million cybersecurity company I aggressively built from the ground up. The specific document on the right is the forged version Julian secretly submitted to the public registry just 48 hours ago." I confidently clicked the remote again. The massive screen instantly zoomed in so incredibly close that the forged signature was physically larger than Julian himself. "You will highly notice a very interesting, entirely new clause heavily inserted on his version," I smoothly continued, casually pacing the altar exactly like a highly seasoned prosecutor in a federal courtroom. "It legally claims that he is the incredibly visionary co-founder of my business, and illegally entitles him to exactly 50% of my entire life's work the absolute second this ceremony concludes. It is a highly brilliant financial strategy. Really, except for the highly minor detail that it absolutely constitutes severe federal wire fraud and massive felony forgery. Julian stood completely, entirely frozen, his eyes darting highly frantically between me and the giant, glaring screen. Heavy sweat began to actively bead rapidly on his forehead, entirely ruining his perfectly styled hair. He desperately opened his mouth to deny it, to loudly claim it was a simple, stupid clerical error made carelessly by his legal team. But I was already one massive step ahead of his pathetic, desperate lies. I firmly pressed the button a highly anticipated third time. A heavily encrypted email exchange instantly popped up directly over the large legal documents. It was visibly sent from Julian's private, encrypted account to his own attorney, complete with highly irrefutable, undeniable digital timestamps. I loudly read his exact, damning words aloud to the highly breathless audience. Just silently slide the new page 15 into the stack. She is far too obsessed with the wedding dresses and floral arrangements to read the final draft. She will not suspect a single thing. A highly collective, incredibly loud gasp heavily echoed through the church. The highly elitist society guests, who had been actively whispering vicious, terrible insults about my modest background just minutes ago, were now actively staring at the supposed golden boy of Wall Street with absolute, unadulterated horror and intense disgust. The highly beautiful illusion of the wealthy, incredibly benevolent groom actively rescuing the poor orphan girl entirely shattered into a million highly irreversible pieces. He was absolutely not a savior. He was completely exposed as a desperate, common thief wearing an incredibly expensive custom tuxedo. Julian reached frantically for the microphone, his hands trembling incredibly violently. "Clara, please," he actively begged, his voice heavily cracking with sheer, unmitigated panic and massive desperation. "This is a massive, terrible misunderstanding. You are actively taking this completely out of context. Turn the screen completely off right now. We can easily talk about this in private. Do not do this heavily in front of all our friends and family." I took another incredibly calculated step heavily back, keeping the microphone entirely, firmly in my grip. "We are highly past the point of private, quiet conversations, Julian," I replied incredibly coldly, my voice aggressively cutting through his intense panic like a sharp knife. "You explicitly wanted a massive, highly public spectacle. You desperately wanted all of your highly sophisticated friends to actively sit here and watch you claim your ultimate, massive financial prize. I am simply highly giving you the incredibly grand audience you actively requested." In the incredibly close front row, Victoria finally snapped completely out of her totally paralyzed shock. The absolutely terrifying reality of her son being highly publicly exposed as a severe federal felon finally fully registered in her highly arrogant brain. She violently jumped up from her pew, her ridiculous silver dress rustling incredibly loudly in the incredibly quiet church. She aggressively pointed a highly shaking manicured finger heavily toward the back of the cathedral. "Somebody severely cut the power," Victoria violently shrieked, her voice completely, utterly hysterical and incredibly shrill. "Turn that projector screen off right this immediate second. Call the venue manager. Completely cut the electricity to the entire massive building." A few of Julian's highly arrogant groomsmen immediately actively bolted down the long center aisle, heavily sprinting rapidly toward the audio-visual control room at the absolute back of the church to aggressively shut down the main breaker. But they absolutely did not make it very far. As they frantically reached the heavy oak doors of the control booth, 4 incredibly massive men wearing highly sharp black suits and discreet earpieces aggressively stepped totally out of the shadows. They confidently crossed their thick arms, completely, utterly blocking the entrance exactly like an impenetrable massive wall. I had heavily hired a highly private corporate security firm for the entire day, and they were actively worth every single, highly expensive penny. "Do not completely bother, Victoria," I actively announced highly loudly, making absolutely sure every single person sitting in the room clearly heard me. My highly elite security team has incredibly strict instructions. Absolutely nobody touches that control panel until I am entirely finished presenting my massive evidence. And trust me, I'm just barely getting started with the highly complex financial audit of this terrible family. I rapidly turned my intense gaze completely away from the highly panicked groomsmen, struggling entirely helplessly against my private security detail at the back of the church. I looked very directly at the front rows of the massive cathedral. The highly elite guests, the exact same people who had just actively spent the last hour aggressively whispering about how incredibly lucky I was to be rescued from my modest upbringing, were now actively shifting highly uncomfortably in their expensive, polished seats. The extremely smug arrogance that had fully filled the room just moments ago had entirely, totally evaporated. They were aggressively staring at Julian like he was a complete, terrifying stranger. I heavily locked eyes deeply with Victoria. She had completely sank back into the hard wooden pew, her face a horrific mask of absolute, undeniable terror. She finally fully realized I had totally bypassed her son's shallow, pathetic lies and actively dug entirely directly into the absolute darkest core of her entirely fabricated high society life. I firmly pressed the button on my highly customized remote control for the fourth consecutive time. The massive image of the forged prenuptial agreement completely vanished from the massive projector screen highly behind me. It was immediately, rapidly replaced by a highly detailed, officially state-stamped legal document from the New York Real Estate Registry. The incredibly bold red letters at the highly visible top of the page clearly read, "Notice of imminent foreclosure." I highly utilized the remote to aggressively zoom in on the exact property address, making absolutely, undoubtedly sure every single wealthy person sitting in those mahogany pews could highly clearly read the exact location. It was the exact, highly specific address of Victoria's incredibly precious, heavily boasted about Hampton's estate, the absolute crown jewel she constantly, aggressively used to assert her massive dominance over everyone else. Your entire, highly fake high society family is completely, utterly bankrupt, Julian, I heavily announced, my voice highly echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. I actively walked highly slowly down the altar steps, completely closing the distance heavily between myself and the front row. I desperately wanted to actively look directly down at them. Did you honestly, really think I would absolutely not run a massive, highly comprehensive corporate background check on the desperate man who was actively, heavily demanding half of my digital forensics empire? Let us completely talk about the absolute real reason why you severely needed my money so incredibly desperately today. You were absolutely not stepping highly away from Wall Street to aggressively start your own independent venture capital firm. You were totally fired from your highly prestigious investment bank precisely 6 months ago for severe, highly illegal insider trading violations. And instead of actively finding an honest job, you heavily leveraged highly vulnerable assets you absolutely did not actively own and completely lost absolutely everything in the volatile options market. I intensely looked highly out at the massive sea of wealthy guests, actively making absolutely sure to make heavy eye contact completely with the exact women who had actively mocked my simple silk dress. You all heavily thought Julian was actively doing incredible charity work by marrying the poor, uneducated orphan girl, I said highly smoothly, my exact tone heavily dripping with icy, undeniable satisfaction. The absolute truth is he is entirely drowning in a massive, aggressive margin call from Apex Capital. He explicitly owes them exactly $3.2 million. And because he had absolutely no liquid cash entirely left, he actively, secretly used a heavily forged power of attorney to completely use his mother's generational summer home as severe collateral. That massive house aggressively goes to a heavily public bank auction in exactly 48 hours. I turned back to Julian. You absolutely did not want a loving wife, Julian. You heavily wanted an entirely blind financial bailout. You severely needed my hard-earned capital to completely save your mother from being permanently locked out of her own home. The absolute silence in the massive cathedral was entirely absolute and incredibly suffocating. The incredibly wealthy elites heavily stared at Victoria. She was currently aggressively covering her entirely pale face with both of her shaking hands, her thin shoulders shaking incredibly violently as she was utterly, entirely destroyed by the massively crushing public humiliation. Her entirely fake empire was completely gone. The guests heavily began murmuring highly loudly again, completely appalled by the entire lack of shame actively displayed by the grooming groom. But Julian was absolutely not finished actively fighting. The sheer, overwhelming desperation of actively losing his multi-million-dollar ultimate prize pushed him completely, entirely over the incredibly sharp edge of rational sanity. He absolutely could not heavily accept that he had been entirely outsmarted completely by the exact woman he considered entirely beneath him. He violently lunged heavily forward, his face completely twisted in highly manic, heavily sweating rage, and actively grabbed the heavy metal base of the microphone stand. He aggressively yanked it heavily toward his wet mouth, breathing incredibly heavily into the highly advanced audio system. He was actively gripping the metal pole so incredibly tightly his knuckles were completely, undeniably white. He heavily looked exactly like a highly cornered animal, entirely refusing to accept its completely inevitable fate. "It entirely does not highly matter," Julian aggressively yelled highly into the microphone, his loud voice violently cracking with wildly delusional, severe panic. "It completely does not matter what exactly you heavily show them up on that giant screen. I actively walking entirely down this aisle today and fully participating actively in this ceremony. You have entirely, absolutely already established a binding, heavy verbal and highly physical commitment. We actively live completely together. My aggressive lawyers will heavily argue common law asset merging. You actively wore the white dress. You highly stood entirely at the altar heavily in front of hundreds of highly affluent witnesses. The explicit intent to marry is highly legally documented. I still completely own half your massive company, Clara. You absolutely cannot just completely walk highly away with my massive money." Julian violently screamed those exact words heavily into the microphone, his chest actively heaving with highly desperate, heavily ragged breaths. He truly, genuinely believed his absolute last-minute legal argument would completely save him. He totally thought he could highly bully me into absolute compliance right there entirely at the altar. I absolutely did not actively back highly away from his sudden, aggressive outburst. I totally did not flinch. Instead, I gracefully tipped my head slightly back and heavily laughed. It was absolutely not a highly hysterical laugh. It was a deeply chilling, incredibly triumphant sound that highly echoed completely through the massive cathedral, slicing absolutely entirely through the heavy tension entirely in the room. The absolute sheer absurdity entirely of his massive arrogance was almost incredibly poetic. He was completely a drowning man, aggressively trying to claim total ownership of the massive ocean that was currently actively swallowing him entirely whole. My laughter rapidly sent a highly visible shiver entirely down Julian's spine. His highly manic rage entirely faltered, replaced instantly by an incredibly sudden creeping dread. He finally realized I was completely not acting highly like a desperate woman who had just been totally trapped by a massive legal loophole. I was heavily acting exactly like a woman who had entirely, already won the massive war. I completely stopped highly laughing and entirely looked him exactly dead deeply in the eyes. I rapidly reached entirely into the deeply hidden seam of my custom wedding gown one completely final time. I actively pulled out a highly single, incredibly neatly folded piece of crisp paper. It was absolutely not a fake prop. It was a heavily certified, highly official financial transfer confirmation, completely from my incredibly ruthless corporate attorney. I actively held the crisp white legal document entirely up in the air, highly ensuring the bright cathedral lights fully caught the official, incredibly heavy gold seal actively pressed deeply into the bottom corner. You really should have actively updated your complete legal knowledge heavily before aggressively attempting a massive corporate heist, Julian, I said highly smoothly, gently bringing the microphone completely back entirely up to my lips. My voice was highly, dangerously calm. Common law aggressive asset merging highly only absolutely applies to entirely physical assets that actually, legally exist completely under my personal name precisely at the exact time the massive marriage is heavily formalized. But you see, I woke entirely up very highly early this specific morning. I actively made a highly important, incredibly long phone call entirely to my massive legal team precisely at 3:00 a.m. I actively took a highly slow, completely steady step significantly closer entirely to him, actively forcing him to completely look directly, intensely at the incredibly crisp paper actively in my hand. "Check the highly public corporate registry completely, Julian," I instructed, my exact words actively falling exactly like highly heavy stones completely into the incredibly silent church. As of precisely 6:00 this exact morning, Clara Incorporated absolutely entirely no longer physically exists highly under my personal portfolio. I actively executed an incredibly emergency corporate poison pill massive protocol. I totally liquidated completely all my highly vulnerable domestic accounts and totally transferred my entire 100% equity stake entirely into a highly secure, completely irrevocable offshore blind trust, totally located in an incredibly secure jurisdiction. Julian actively stared completely at me, his mouth entirely opening and totally closing silently exactly like a highly suffocating fish. His eyes actively darted incredibly frantically as his former, highly broken banker brain desperately, totally tried to completely process the massive financial maneuver I had highly just exactly described. "Do you completely understand what that exactly means?" I asked, highly leaning intensely in slightly so absolutely only he and the very first few incredibly close rows could actively see the entire zero mercy heavily in my eyes. "It explicitly means that my absolute legal net worth highly on paper is exactly, entirely zero. I absolutely do not totally own the massive company anymore. The offshore trust administrators entirely own it. I have absolutely totally no domestic liquid capital entirely for you to highly claim. You actively spent the last 6 entire months heavily planning a massive, incredible financial fraud. You totally risked a highly severe federal felony conviction entirely to aggressively forge a massive contract. You totally dragged your highly toxic mother and your incredibly snobby friends completely into this extremely pathetic illusion. And you actively did it completely all entirely to violently steal exactly 50% of absolutely, totally nothing." The exact words actively landed completely with the highly devastating force entirely of a massive physical blow. The absolute, entire finality of my statement heavily shattered the absolute last entirely remaining pieces completely of his wildly delusional confidence. The exact financial safety net entirely he had aggressively relied completely on to entirely save his highly toxic mother's house, and entirely clear his incredibly massive hedge fund debt had absolutely, completely vanished entirely into highly thin air. He had entirely played his highly absolute final card, and he had entirely, completely lost absolutely everything. Julian's highly weak legs simply entirely gave completely out. The arrogant groom, the highly supposed golden boy entirely of his high society circle, completely collapsed totally right there, exactly on the pristine, highly polished marble floor completely of the massive cathedral. He aggressively dropped heavily to his knees, his incredibly expensive custom tuxedo completely crumpling exactly around him. He totally stared blankly, entirely at the ground, his chest actively shuddering exactly as the full, entirely crushing weight completely of his massive impending financial ruin and highly inevitable legal prosecution aggressively crashed entirely down heavily on his shoulders. He was entirely, utterly broken. The entire crowd completely watched highly in entirely stunned silence exactly as the arrogant, entirely disgraced investment banker completely sobbed highly quietly entirely at the altar. It was a completely pathetic, deeply, highly satisfying sight. But exactly as I entirely looked heavily down completely at the massive failure who had actively tried to totally destroy my entire life, I felt absolutely no exact pity. I entirely felt exactly only the cold, sharp, highly undeniable clarity exactly of total justice. I entirely stepped completely around his highly kneeling form, the exactly long train completely of my expensive silk gown sweeping highly elegantly completely across the entire floor. I had absolutely successfully entirely neutralized the highly primary threat, but the highly comprehensive corporate audit completely of this entirely corrupt family was absolutely not highly finished yet. My exact gaze heavily swept entirely past Julian and totally locked absolutely directly onto the incredibly front row. I highly bypassed the violently hyperventilating Victoria and focused completely, entirely on T. He incredibly panicked woman totally sitting precisely next to her. I highly turned my exact attention entirely straight to Chloe. Chloe actively sat completely frozen heavily in the incredibly front pew, totally paralyzed exactly by the entirely sudden shift highly in my absolute attention. The incredibly expensive designer silk dress, entirely, she was highly so completely proud exactly of now heavily looked entirely like a highly ridiculous cheap costume. Her highly perfectly manicured hands completely were actively gripping her exactly incredibly expensive luxury clutch, so entirely tightly exactly her knuckles completely were highly stark white. She had actively spent the completely entire morning exactly mocking me entirely, highly complaining incredibly loudly completely about her exactly husband's highly reluctant refusal entirely to actively buy a highly ridiculous $10,000 watch, and entirely acting exactly like she was the completely undisputed highly arrogant queen exactly of Manhattan. Now she was completely staring actively up highly at me exactly with incredibly wide, entirely terrified eyes. She completely finally actively realized exactly that entirely if I had highly the extreme technical ability exactly to totally unearth Julian's completely deeply buried incredibly highly massive financial ruin, I entirely likely highly knew exactly every single complete detail entirely about her exact desperate, incredibly illegal attempts entirely to actively cover highly it exactly up. I entirely did completely not exactly speak directly highly to Chloe. She totally did completely not actively deserve my incredibly precise words highly or exactly my completely valuable time. Instead, I entirely shifted my highly intense gaze completely slightly exactly to the entirely right, highly looking directly completely at the exact incredibly exhausted, entirely hardworking African-American highly brilliant trauma surgeon entirely sitting incredibly stiffly exactly beside highly her. "Marcus," I highly said incredibly softly completely into the entirely exact microphone. My complete voice highly echoed entirely through the incredibly silent exactly massive cathedral, completely providing a highly stark, incredibly gentle contrast exactly to the entirely cold, highly punishing exactly complete tone I had entirely just successfully used highly to exactly destroy Julian. "You exactly are the absolutely entirely only highly decent completely innocent person in exactly this entire toxic family. You entirely spend your exact incredibly long days highly saving entirely actual lives completely in the exactly operating room, highly working entirely grueling 80-hour incredibly long shifts, exactly and completely treating highly everyone around entirely, you exactly with incredibly genuine kindness completely and profound respect. You entirely welcomed highly me completely with highly open arms exactly, and a beautiful, incredibly custom bouquet exactly of flowers entirely this morning. You highly are an exactly good, completely innocent man, Marcus. You entirely, absolutely highly, do not completely exactly deserve entirely what exactly is highly happening entirely behind exactly your back. Marcus completely sat exactly incredibly straight, his highly broad shoulders entirely tensing exactly as his incredibly kind brow completely furrowed entirely, in exact, deep, highly profound confusion. He had absolutely entirely been completely watching Julian's incredibly spectacular, exact complete downfall entirely, with the highly exact same incredibly shocked, entirely breathless exact expression, completely, as the incredibly highly rest entirely of the incredibly exact high society completely guests. Please entirely look precisely at the incredibly exact cell phone completely sitting highly on your lap. I exactly instructed incredibly gently, highly maintaining completely steady exact entire eye contact, incredibly with entirely him. Open the highly secure exactly PDF file. I completely just incredibly entirely texted highly exactly you. A highly profound, incredibly heavy exact complete stillness entirely fell completely over the exactly 300 highly elite guests. Absolutely nobody entirely dared to highly exactly breathe. They entirely watched completely with incredibly exact morbid fascination, highly, as Marcus entirely slowly picked completely up his exactly phone, Highly his completely thumb exactly tapping entirely the incredibly highly smooth glass exactly screen to entirely unlock it. He completely opened the incredibly exact, highly encrypted, completely exact text message. Entirely. I had sent highly exactly him entirely right before I incredibly walked completely exactly down the entirely highly long aisle. As he completely stared incredibly down exactly at the highly bright entire screen completely of his exactly phone, I highly clicked entirely the exact remote control highly in my entirely incredibly exact hand one comp. Lately more highly final time. The absolutely massive exactly projector incredibly highly entire screen completely behind the exactly alter highly shifted entirely instantaneously. The incredibly exact real estate completely highly entirely foreclosure document exactly highly vanished, entirely completely incredibly replaced by exactly a highly detailed, entirely officially incredibly certified completely exact bank wire highly ledger. It entirely was a highly incredibly direct, entirely irrefutable completely exact feed from Marcus Hiley and Chloe's incredibly entirely joint highly high yield exactly completely savings account. I entirely made absolutely sure the exactly highly presentation font completely was incredibly entirely exactly large enough for the incredibly entirely wealthy completely highly exactly elites entirely sitting in the exactly highly back row completely entirely to incredibly clearly highly exactly read the entirely exact incredibly devastating highly completely numbers. Take a entirely exactly good highly close incredibly completely look highly at your entirely incredibly exact house completely exactly down highly payment entirely fund Marcus, I highly said. Entirely my exactly incredibly clear voice completely ringing highly entirely exactly out with completely incredibly crystal highly clarity. The exactly entire money you completely spent entirely the highly last, incredibly exact 5 completely entirely long years, highly diligently exactly saving entirely. The completely money exactly you entirely highly earned completely by entirely incredibly highly exactly sacrificing your entirely sleep, completely your exactly highly weekends, entirely and incredibly your completely exact physical health, entirely highly exactly to completely build entirely a highly incredibly solid completely exact foundation, entirely for your highly exactly marriage. It entirely is exactly completely entirely incredibly gone. I highly used entirely the extremely exact digital pointer completely on my incredibly highly remote exactly control entirely to absolutely highlight exactly a completely incredibly massive entirely highly unauthorized exact entirely completely withdrawal highly recorded exactly just entirely incredibly 2 completely exact weeks highly ago entirely. Your entirely exactly incredibly toxic wife completely did not highly entirely just exactly encourage her highly completely entire brother's highly entirely incredibly delusional exactly completely financial exactly highly gambling entirely. I absolutely explained exactly entirely completely to the highly incredibly captivated entirely crowd, highly finally turning exactly my completely cold incredibly entire stare, highly exactly back entirely to Chloe. Highly who completely exactly was now incredibly entirely trembling, entirely highly uncontrollably exactly, in her entirely incredibly completely seat. When entirely Julian exactly highly completely needed incredibly entire exactly emergency, liquid highly cash entirely exactly completely, to highly incredibly entire, completely, keep the exactly incredibly entirely highly angry exactly hedge entirely fund completely from highly incredibly seizing exactly this completely entire entirely highly precious family exactly estate. Chloe completely entirely exactly highly entirely bypassed, incredibly exactly your entire, exactly highly completely dual authorization, highly entire security, entirely incredibly protocols. She exactly highly entirely forged completely your highly exact digital entirely incredibly signature, completely, to exactly highly entirely authorize the highly exactly entire incredibly complete transfer. She highly entirely completely drained exactly $500,000 of incredibly your entire highly exactly hardworking, Money entirely completely. And exactly highly incredibly entirely wired exactly it entirely highly completely directly into Julian's incredibly failing entirely exactly highly portfolio. She exactly entirely completely stole highly, your incredibly exact entirely complete future, exactly highly, to entirely completely exactly highly pay, for their incredibly entire highly fake aristocratic exactly image. Marcus highly entirely, completely, did not exactly highly look entire incredibly up exactly at the highly completely massive entirely screen exactly entirely highly completely behind me. He entirely completely kept highly his incredibly exactly entirely entire eyes, exactly glued highly to his entirely completely phone, highly scrolling, exactly incredibly methodically entirely, through the exactly highly official entirely completely bank incredibly exactly statements highly entirely I had completely provided. His highly exactly entirely handsome completely incredibly face exactly went entirely completely slack. The incredibly exact, highly deep, completely entire exhaustion, exactly. That highly already entirely completely weighed highly exactly incredibly heavily on highly exactly. Entirely him completely seemed to incredibly multiply exactly a completely highly entirely 100 times, highly exactly over entirely, in incredibly completely, a single exactly highly entire devastating, completely entirely highly exactly second. I entirely completely watched exactly his highly entire incredibly heartbreak, completely exactly entirely, in real incredibly exact highly complete time. He entirely completely had highly exactly incredibly, endured entirely her exact highly completely endless incredibly exactly complaints, her exactly highly entirely complete shallow, incredibly exactly vanity. Highly entirely, and her incredibly exactly completely constant highly entire, entitled incredibly exact entirely completely demands highly for exactly incredibly luxury, entirely completely goods exactly highly incredibly entirely, because entirely completely exactly, he genuinely highly incredibly completely loved her. And she exactly highly entirely had completely incredibly entirely repaid exactly his entirely completely highly unwavering incredibly exact devotion, completely exactly by highly committing entirely federal, completely incredibly exact wire fraud highly, to entirely completely exactly rob incredibly him, completely entirely highly exactly blind. Suddenly, Chloe entirely highly completely exactly snapped. The incredibly exactly highly terrifying complete entirely exactly reality, highly of her exactly entirely completely husband, incredibly exactly discovering entirely completely highly, her exactly massive, highly incredibly entire criminal completely exactly entirely betrayal, entirely completely highly shattered her incredibly exactly entire arrogant completely highly entirely composure. No. Chloe entirely exactly completely shrieked. Exactly highly entirely her voice, highly completely incredibly exactly piercing. Entirely completely hysterical highly exact wail completely. That highly exactly incredibly echoed terribly completely against the exactly entirely highly high completely stone entirely exact ceilings of the entirely highly complete exactly church. She highly entirely completely lunged, violently exactly sideways highly in the entirely exactly wooden pew, incredibly wildly exactly entirely throwing her highly, completely entirely hands exactly toward Marcus entirely exactly completely, to highly snatch entirely, the incredibly exact entirely highly completely phone away, exactly from highly entirely completely him. It exactly is entirely highly completely a lie. Marcus, completely do exactly entirely highly not incredibly look exactly at highly entirely completely it. She entirely is a completely exactly highly computer entire incredibly exact hacker. She exactly completely entirely highly fabricated completely, all entirely exactly of highly entirely incredibly, those exact documents, completely just exactly highly entirely, to ruin exactly our incredibly complete entirely highly family. Give exactly me entirely highly completely, the incredibly exact entirely phone completely highly right now. She entirely, completely, exactly clawed highly, frantically, completely, exactly at his entirely, highly, incredibly hands. Exactly, highly, entirely, sobbing, completely, exactly, violently. Entirely desperate, highly, to exactly, completely, incredibly destroy highly, the undeniable, completely, exact, entirely proof. Exactly, highly, completely of her incredibly entire, exactly, ultimate, entirely, highly, completely betrayal. Marcus entirely, highly, completely, exactly did not flinch. He entirely, highly, did completely, exactly, not entirely yell highly, exactly, completely, or try entirely to completely match exactly her entirely, highly frantic, completely hysterical, entirely, exact, incredibly energy. He entirely, simply, completely, highly, exactly stood incredibly up. His entirely, completely, highly, exact, tall. Broad, completely, entire, highly frame, incredibly, exactly towering entirely over highly, completely, her exact, incredibly, entirely, completely pathetic shrinking, entirely, highly, exactly figure highly, in the completely, exactly wooden, entirely pew. He highly, entirely, completely, easily, entirely, and highly, exactly, firmly, completely pulled highly, his entirely, exactly, incredibly hands, completely, entirely, highly, exactly away from entirely her completely, exactly manic, incredibly, highly grip. Completely, exactly, entirely holding highly, his entirely, completely cell, exact, highly phone, entirely, securely, completely, exactly out of entirely, highly, completely her incredibly exact reach. His entirely, highly, exactly complete face, highly, completely, usually, entirely, exactly so warm, completely, entirely, highly, incredibly patient, exactly, entirely, and highly, completely full of exact, entirely life, completely, highly, exactly was incredibly, entirely unrecognizable. It entirely, highly, completely, exactly was a terrifying, entirely, highly, heart-wrenching, incredibly, exactly complete mixture of entirely profound, exactly, highly heartbreak, entirely, completely, and absolute. Exactly, incredibly, highly cold, completely, entirely fury. He entirely, highly, completely looked exactly, incredibly down highly at the entirely, completely exact woman. Highly, he had entirely, completely, exactly, incredibly loved. The completely, entirely, highly woman he exactly, entirely, completely had exhausted highly, his entirely, exactly own body, completely, to incredibly, entirely provide highly, exactly for. Entirely, exactly, completely, as if he highly, entirely, were completely, exactly looking incredibly highly at a completely exact total, exactly, entirely stranger. Chloe entirely, highly, completely realized exactly physical force entirely, completely, was incredibly not highly exactly going to completely entirely work. She exactly immediately completely entirely switched highly her tactics. Entirely completely highly falling exactly back entirely on highly. The completely exactly manipulative entirely incredibly highly gaslighting. Exactly. She entirely completely had highly incredibly used exactly to entirely completely control, highly him exactly for completely entirely years. She highly exactly entirely looked completely incredibly exactly up highly at completely entirely him. Exactly her entirely incredibly expensive completely exactly mascara, running highly entirely down completely exactly her highly face, entirely completely exactly and thick, completely dark entirely streaks. Highly and entirely tried to completely exactly incredibly play highly the ultimate, entirely completely exactly victim. Marcus, entirely exactly you highly completely incredibly have entirely to exactly highly listen completely to entirely me. She highly exactly completely pleaded. Entirely her voice completely exactly incredibly a desperate. Highly completely entirely urgent whisper. Exactly entirely highly meant completely to incredibly exactly entirely, keep highly. The exactly entirely completely surrounding highly elite, entirely, exactly incredibly guests completely from entirely exactly highly hearing completely her entirely exactly pathetic highly incredibly complete exactly lies. I exactly entirely highly completely only did exactly, it highly completely entirely. Because exactly I completely highly incredibly was entirely exactly terrified. You exactly entirely work highly completely exactly, so much entirely highly incredibly. You exactly completely are entirely never exactly highly home. Entirely and I completely highly exactly was so incredibly entirely completely stressed exactly highly entirely about my exactly mother completely highly incredibly losing entirely her house. I highly exactly completely was entirely incredibly exactly going to entirely completely put highly the exactly entire completely money incredibly exactly highly back before entirely you exactly completely incredibly even highly entirely noticed exactly it completely was exactly highly gone. I entirely exactly completely highly did exactly it entirely completely for incredibly exactly highly us Marcus. I exactly highly completely entirely did incredibly exactly highly it completely entirely to exactly incredibly protect entirely our highly completely exactly family entirely reputation highly completely exactly in this entirely incredibly city. You exactly entirely highly completely forced exactly entirely me into this highly completely exact horrible entirely position completely exactly incredibly because entirely you exactly highly completely refused to entirely exactly help completely Julian entirely highly exactly when completely he entirely exactly needed completely it highly entirely the exactly most. You entirely exactly are incredibly highly completely making exactly a huge completely entirely highly deal out exactly of entirely highly a temporary completely exactly incredibly family entirely highly loan. The entirely exactly highly completely absolute sheer entirely audacity exactly highly completely of her incredibly exact entirely highly words hung entirely exactly heavily completely highly in the exactly entirely tense highly complete incredibly silent entirely exactly air completely highly of the entirely exact cathedral. She exactly entirely completely was highly actually entirely trying exactly completely highly to incredibly entirely completely blame exactly him entirely highly for completely her incredibly exact federal highly entirely completely felony. She highly exactly entirely was completely incredibly entirely trying to highly weaponize exactly completely his entirely incredibly 80-hour exactly highly completely entirely work weeks. Highly the completely exactly entirely very hospital incredibly exact entirely highly completely shifts. Exactly he entirely highly incredibly took exactly completely to entirely buy exactly highly completely her entirely dream incredibly exact highly house completely as an entirely exactly highly incredibly excuse exactly completely for entirely stealing highly his entirely exactly complete highly incredibly life completely exactly savings. Marcus entirely highly shook exactly completely his incredibly head slowly. Entirely exactly a highly complete incredibly bitter. Exactly entirely humorless highly completely exactly smile touching highly the entirely corners exactly completely of his entirely highly incredibly mouth. He entirely completely exactly highly did incredibly entirely not completely exactly raise highly his entirely completely exact voice. Highly entirely, but incredibly in the exactly completely highly dead silence, entirely exactly completely of the incredibly exactly highly complete church. His entirely exact highly words incredibly completely exactly carried entirely highly completely with exactly devastating, incredibly entirely undeniable highly completely exact clarity. You completely exactly entirely highly did not incredibly entirely exactly do completely highly this for entirely exactly us. Chloe, Marcus highly entirely completely replied. Entirely his incredibly exact highly voice completely entirely vibrating highly completely exactly with exactly incredibly a deep. Entirely highly completely resonant anger, exactly entirely highly completely. That made highly the entirely exactly incredibly wealthy, exactly completely guests highly entirely. In the exactly incredibly completely highly nearby pews, entirely physically exactly highly lean, incredibly completely back highly entirely, in exactly discomfort. You entirely exactly completely highly did exactly this entirely completely to incredibly highly maintain exactly entirely a fake, Completely, highly, incredibly, pathetic, exactly, entirely image. Just entirely, exactly, highly, completely. This incredibly exact morning. You entirely, highly, completely stood exactly, incredibly, highly, and entirely, completely. The exact, entirely, bridal, highly, completely, incredibly, sweet, exactly. And highly, entirely, completely, screamed exactly, highly, entirely, at completely, incredibly me. Exactly for entirely, highly, completely, not exactly buying highly your entirely, completely brother exactly an incredible $10,000 entirely, highly, completely luxury. Exact, entirely watch. You exactly, highly, completely called me highly, entirely, exactly a failure, completely, highly, entirely, incredibly. Because entirely, I only completely, exactly wrote highly him, exactly, entirely, incredibly, a $2,000 completely, exactly, highly check. All entirely, highly, exactly, completely. While highly you incredibly, entirely, exactly knew completely. You entirely, highly, completely, had already incredibly, exactly, entirely stolen. Half a entirely, highly, completely million, incredibly, exactly dollars completely, entirely from highly. My incredibly, exactly, completely bank, highly, entirely account. Chloe completely, exactly opened, highly, entirely her incredibly exact mouth completely to argue. Exactly, highly, entirely. But Marcus completely, entirely, highly cut exactly her entirely, completely, incredibly off. Exactly, highly, his completely, entirely voice hardening, entirely, completely, exactly into steel. I entirely, completely, highly spent the highly, entirely, completely last 5 incredibly exact years. Entirely, completely standing on highly, exactly, entirely. My completely feet entirely, highly in emergency. Exactly, completely rooms entirely covered, highly, incredibly, exactly, and complete, entirely blood. Exactly, highly, completely trying to entirely, highly save, exactly, completely, actual, entirely, incredibly lives, highly, exactly, completely. So I could highly give exactly you completely the incredibly, entirely, beautiful, entirely, exactly, future, completely, highly you demanded. Marcus highly, entirely, completely continued. Highly, exactly, his eyes incredibly, completely, entirely burning, with entirely, exactly, highly betrayed, completely fury. And highly, exactly, entirely. You completely threw highly all exactly, completely of my incredibly, entirely, exact sacrifice, highly, entirely, into a completely, exactly furnace, entirely, highly, to incredibly save completely, exactly a house, highly, entirely. Your mother completely, exactly cannot incredibly, entirely even afford highly, exactly, completely to entirely keep. You entirely, exactly, highly, completely do not completely, exactly care entirely, highly, incredibly about completely, exactly me. You entirely, exactly, highly do not completely, exactly, highly respect my incredibly, entirely, exactly hard work. You highly, entirely, exactly only care completely, entirely about highly. The exact, completely, incredibly bank account entirely, exactly, highly attached completely to entirely, exactly my name. Chloe highly, entirely, completely reached out. Highly, her exactly, completely, entirely, incredibly hands trembling highly, exactly, completely, violently. Exactly, entirely trying to highly, entirely, completely grab the incredibly, exactly, highly fabric completely, entirely of his highly, exact, entirely, completely tailored, incredibly charcoal, completely, highly suit jacket. Marcus, completely, exactly, highly, please. She entirely, exactly sobbed, highly complete. Telly entirely abandoning exactly her completely, highly quiet whisper, entirely, incredibly, and highly, exactly, completely wailing, openly, entirely, highly, completely, exactly in front, entirely, highly, completely of the entire, entirely, exactly, incredibly, exact congregation. Please, completely, exactly, entirely, highly. Do not do entirely, exactly, completely. This right, highly, entirely, exactly now. We completely, exactly, highly, incredibly can fix entirely, completely this. We exactly, entirely, highly, completely can go to highly, exactly, completely counseling. I entirely, exactly, highly, completely will get entirely, exactly retail, highly, completely, incredibly job. I entirely, exactly will highly, completely pay you entirely, exactly, incredibly back, every completely, exactly, highly, single cent. Just entirely, exactly, completely sit highly, entirely down. Everyone entirely, exactly, completely is staring highly, entirely, exactly at completely us. Everyone highly, exactly, entirely is completely staring entirely highly exactly. Because you completely entirely finally highly showed exactly completely them exactly incredibly highly, who entirely completely exactly you are. Marcus entirely highly completely said coldly. Entirely exactly highly ignoring her completely exactly entirely grasping highly completely incredibly hands. He highly entirely completely looked exactly incredibly down at highly exactly entirely his completely left hand. Without an entirely exactly highly single completely entirely moment of highly exactly entirely hesitation. He entirely exactly completely incredibly reached over highly entirely completely exactly and slid highly the entirely exactly completely heavy gold incredibly exactly entirely wedding highly completely entirely band exactly off highly entirely completely his ring exactly entirely finger. The entirely highly metal exactly completely caught the highly bright entirely incredibly afternoon exactly completely light, filtering entirely exactly highly completely through the incredibly stained exactly highly entirely complete glass entirely windows, as he entirely highly exactly completely held exactly it entirely highly up for incredibly completely fraction exactly entirely highly completely of a second. Then he entirely exactly highly completely let it exactly entirely fall. The highly entirely exactly complete ring completely exactly highly dropped, perfectly entirely exactly, into the entirely completely highly incredibly center, exactly of her entirely exactly highly expensive, completely designer highly entirely lap. My entirely exactly highly complete incredibly lawyer will entirely exactly highly serve you entirely completely the incredibly exactly highly divorce, exactly entirely completely papers highly entirely, on incredibly exactly Monday completely exactly morning. Marcus entirely highly completely stated. His exactly highly entirely complete voice, entirely highly stripped completely of all exactly entirely emotion. Highly exactly completely delivering the exactly highly entirely final, completely fatal, entirely exactly blow, to entirely highly completely, incredibly, or highly entirely fabricated world. I highly entirely exactly will completely incredibly exactly be securing entirely completely highly, my exactly medical highly, entirely completely entirely practice exactly entirely, and freezing entirely highly completely all of entirely, are exactly incredibly highly completely remaining, joint exactly entirely completely highly accounts before entirely exactly, I completely incredibly exactly even leave entirely highly, the parking exactly completely lot highly entirely today. Do exactly highly entirely completely incredibly not call entirely, my exactly completely highly phone. Do highly entirely exactly completely not incredibly exactly show up entirely highly at my exactly completely hospital. Do highly entirely exactly completely not ever entirely exactly incredibly contact exactly me highly entirely completely again. Marcus highly entirely completely did not exactly wait for entirely her incredibly exact completely highly response. He entirely exactly highly completely did not look exactly at Victoria. Entirely highly completely, who was entirely exactly incredibly still hyperventilating exactly entirely highly completely in the front entirely exactly completely highly row. Or entirely Julian, exactly highly completely, who was entirely exactly incredibly still kneeling. Exactly highly entirely completely defeated at the entirely highly exactly completely altar. Marcus exactly highly entirely simply turned completely his entirely exactly incredibly highly back on entirely exactly, the entire highly completely exactly toxic entirely family. He highly entirely completely stepped exactly out into the highly entirely incredibly center, exactly completely highly aisle of entirely, the exactly completely cathedral highly entirely, and began entirely to highly exactly incredibly completely walk. His entirely actly highly footsteps completely exactly echoed, highly entirely loudly, against entirely, the exactly incredibly completely marble highly floor, entirely steady completely exactly highly and purposeful. The entirely 300 exactly highly incredibly completely high society, entirely exactly guests. The completely highly entirely people Chloe exactly entirely had been entirely so highly incredibly completely desperate exactly entirely to impress. Parted highly exactly completely like the red exactly entirely sea. Entirely highly completely watching an entirely exactly incredibly absolute silence, highly completely, and deep entirely respect, as exactly the highly completely incredibly brilliant surgeon exactly entirely completely walked highly entirely away from entirely exactly, the completely incredibly highly wreckage of his exactly entirely marriage. The entirely heavy exactly highly completely oak doors, entirely exactly of the incredibly highly completely church, opened entirely exactly, and completely highly closed behind exactly entirely him, with completely incredibly, a resounding highly exactly entirely thud. The entirely exactly sound highly completely echoed through entirely exactly the silent highly completely cathedral, serving exactly entirely as the incredibly highly completely final death knell, entirely exactly for Chloe's highly completely marriage. She exactly entirely completely collapsed sideways entirely highly into the exactly incredibly completely wooden pew, entirely burying her highly exactly completely face in entirely exactly her hands, highly completely her loud, incredibly exactly ugly entirely sobs, vibrating highly completely through the exactly entirely quiet room. The exactly entirely highly completely first pillar entirely of their exactly incredibly highly complete entirely fake completely empire, highly exactly, had officially entirely completely crumbled, leaving entirely exactly the rest highly completely incredibly of the entirely family, completely exactly highly exposed, to entirely my exactly highly completely final judgment. But entirely, the exactly absolute highly completely destruction of entirely her exactly daughter's highly completely life was entirely not exactly what finally highly completely broke Victoria. It entirely exactly was highly completely incredibly the terrifying, entirely exactly undeniable completely highly realization, entirely, that the exactly highly money was entirely completely incredibly gone. Marcus entirely was exactly highly completely not going entirely exactly to bail highly completely them out. I entirely exactly was highly completely not going entirely exactly to bail highly completely them out. The $3 million entirely exactly debt, highly completely, was incredibly exactly entirely real. The entirely highly foreclosure exactly completely on her entirely Hampton's highly completely estate was entirely exactly absolute. And the entirely high society exactly highly completely friends, she entirely had exactly spent decades entirely highly trying completely to impress entirely, were exactly currently highly completely watching her entirely entire exactly dynasty highly completely burn to entirely the exactly ground. Victoria, entirely highly completely snapped. The entirely carefully exactly crafted mask highly completely of aristocratic entirely exactly elegance, she highly completely wore like entirely exactly a second highly completely skin, entirely melted exactly away in an highly completely instant, entirely revealing exactly the feral, highly completely desperate entirely exactly creature hiding highly completely underneath. You entirely exactly miserable highly completely little witch. Victoria entirely shrieked, exactly highly completely her voice entirely tearing exactly through highly completely the cathedral entirely like exactly scraping highly completely metal. She entirely lunged exactly out of highly completely the front entirely exactly pew, completely highly entirely ignoring her exactly completely sobbing daughter. Entirely her expensive exactly silver designer highly completely gown caught entirely exactly on the sharp highly completely corner, entirely exactly of the wooden highly completely bench, entirely tearing exactly the delicate highly completely silk fabric. Entirely but exactly she did highly completely not even entirely exactly notice the highly completely damage. She entirely charged exactly up the highly completely center entirely exactly aisle, her eyes highly completely wide entirely exactly and bloodshot, highly completely her face entirely exactly contorted into highly completely a mask entirely exactly of pure, highly completely unhinged hatred. The entirely sophisticated exactly matriarch, highly completely of Manhattan entirely, was exactly gone. In highly completely, her place entirely was exactly a cornered, highly completely vicious entirely exactly animal. Realizing highly completely, it had entirely exactly been outsmarted. Highly completely by its entirely exactly own prey. You entirely exactly think you highly completely can do entirely exactly this to us. Victoria entirely screamed. Exactly highly completely her expensive entirely exactly heels, clicking highly completely wildly entirely exactly against the marble, highly completely steps entirely of the exactly altar. You entirely exactly think you highly completely can just entirely walk exactly into my highly completely family and entirely destroy exactly everything we highly completely built. You entirely are exactly nothing. You highly completely are a worthless, entirely exactly uneducated, highly completely orphan who entirely exactly came from highly completely, the absolute entirely exactly gutter. We highly completely gave you entirely exactly the ultimate highly completely privilege of entirely wearing exactly our family, highly completely name, and entirely exactly this is how highly completely you repay entirely us. I exactly will highly completely destroy you. I entirely will exactly ruin your highly completely entire pathetic entirely life. She entirely raised exactly her manicured highly completely hands, curling entirely exactly her fingers highly completely into tight entirely exactly claws, fully highly completely intending to entirely exactly physically attack highly completely me right entirely there exactly at the highly completely altar and entirely front exactly of 300 highly completely horrified guests. She entirely was exactly aiming straight highly completely for my entirely exactly face, desperate highly completely to wipe entirely exactly the cold, highly completely victorious entirely exactly smile off my highly completely lips. I entirely did exactly not highly completely even blink. I entirely did exactly not highly completely take a entirely single exactly step highly completely backward. Before entirely Victoria exactly could highly completely even reach entirely exactly the second, highly completely step entirely of exactly the altar. Highly completely two massive entirely exactly men in highly completely sharp black entirely suits exactly materialized highly completely from the entirely exactly side shadows, highly completely of the entirely exactly church. My highly completely private security entirely exactly detail moved highly completely with terrifying entirely exactly silent highly completely efficiency. They entirely intercepted exactly her mid-charge, highly completely stepping firmly entirely exactly between us highly completely, and forming entirely exactly an impenetrable highly completely human wall, entirely exactly of solid highly completely muscle. Victoria entirely crashed exactly hard into highly completely them. The entirely exactly impact knocked highly completely the breath entirely exactly out of highly completely her lungs. Entirely but exactly the sheer, highly completely adrenaline of entirely exactly her rage, highly completely kept her entirely moving. Exactly she thrashed highly completely wildly entirely exactly against the highly completely security guards, entirely kicking exactly her expensive highly completely heels, and entirely swinging exactly her arms highly completely like an entirely chaotic exactly pendulum. Let entirely me exactly go, she highly completely wailed, her entirely perfectly exactly styled hair highly completely falling around entirely exactly her face highly completely in a sweaty,